The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeets.com. Today in the Thom Hartmann University Book Club, we're reading from Johann Hari's brand new book, Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. So he starts out talking about how he had been on antidepressants for most of his life, from his teenage years into his 30s. And then he says, then when I was 31 years old, I found myself chemically naked for the first time in my adult life. For almost a decade, I had been ignoring my therapist's gentle reminders that I was still depressed despite my drugs. It was only after a crisis in my life, when I felt unequivocally terrible and couldn't shake it off, that I decided to listen to him. What I had been trying for so long wasn't, it seemed, working. And so when I flushed away my final packs of Paxil, I found these mysteries waiting for me, like children on a train platform waiting to be collected, trying to catch my eye. Why was I still depressed? Why were there so many people like me? And I realized there was a third mystery hanging over all of it. Could something other than bad brain chemistry have been causing depression and anxiety in me and in so many people all around me? If so, what could it be? Still, I put off looking into it. Once you settle into a story about your pain, you're extremely reluctant to challenge it. It was like a leash I had put on my distress to keep it under control. I feared that if I messed with the story I'd lived with for so long, the pain would be like an unchained animal and would savage me. Over a period of several years, I fell into a pattern. I would begin to research these mysteries by reading scientific papers and talking to some of the scientists who wrote them. But I always backed away because what they said made me feel disoriented and more anxious than I had been at the start. I focused on the work for another book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, instead. It sounds ridiculous to say I found it easier to interview hitmen for the Mexican drug cartels than to look into what causes depression and anxiety. But messing with my story about my emotions, what I felt and why I felt it, seemed more dangerous to me than that. And then finally, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. So over a period of 3 years, I went on a journey of over 40,000 miles. I conducted more than 200 interviews across the world with some of the most important social scientists in the world, with people who had been through the depths of depression and anxiety, and with people who had recovered. I ended up in all sorts of places I couldn't have guessed at in the beginning. An Amish village in Indiana, a Berlin housing project rising up in rebellion, a Brazilian city that had banned advertising, a Baltimore laboratory taking people back through their traumas in a totally unexpected way. What I learned forced me to radically revise my story about myself, my story about the distress spreading like tar over our culture. I want to flag up right at the start 2 things that shape the language I'm going to use through all of this book. I'm reading from the introduction. Both were surprising to me. I was told by my doctor that I was suffering from both depression and acute anxiety. I had believed those were separate problems, and that is how they were discussed for the 13 years I received medical care for them. But I noticed something odd as I did my research. Everything that causes an increase in depression also causes an increase in anxiety, and the other way around. They rise and fall together. It seemed curious, and I began to understand it only when, in Canada, I sat down with Robert Kohlenberg, a professor of psychology. He too once thought that depression and anxiety were different things. But as he studied it for over 20 years now, he discovered, he says, that the data are indicating that they're not distinct. In practice, quote, the diagnoses, particularly depression and anxiety, overlap, end quote. Sometimes one part is more pronounced than the other. You might have panic attacks this month and be crying a lot next month. But the idea that they're separate in the way that, say, having pneumonia and having a broken leg are separate is not borne out by the evidence. Robert's side of the argument has been prevailing in the scientific debate recently. In the past few years, the National Institutes of Health, the main body funding medical research in the United States, has stopped funding studies that present depression and anxiety as different diagnoses. They want something more realistic that corresponds to the way people are in actual clinical practice, he explains. I started to see depression and anxiety as like cover versions of the same song by different bands. Depression is a cover version by a downbeat emo band, and anxiety is a cover version by a screaming heavy metal group. But the underlying sheet music is the same. They're not identical, but they're twinned. The second insight comes from something else I learned as I studied these 9 causes of depression and anxiety that he writes about in this book. Whenever I wrote about depression and anxiety in the past, I started by explaining one thing. I am not talking about unhappiness. Unhappiness and depression are totally different things. There's nothing more infuriating to a depressed person than to be told to cheer up or to be offered jolly little solutions as if they were merely having a bad week. It feels like being told to cheer up yourself by going out dancing after you've broken both your legs. But as I studied the evidence, I noticed something that I couldn't ignore. The forces that are making us depressed and severely anxious are, at the same time, making even more people unhappy. It turns out that there is a continuum between unhappiness and depression. They're still very different in the same way that losing a finger in a car accident is different from losing an arm, and falling over the street is different from falling over the cliff. But they are connected. The book, Lost Connections by Johann. Lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. Congressman Mark Pocan is going to be with us in a few minutes. He's down on the floor of the House voting, and so as soon as the vote is done, he will lickety-split head up to his office and be with us and take your calls for our first hour. It is Anything Goes Friday. There is a terrible shooting in Santa Fe, Texas. Santa Fe, named after St. Francis, right? As is San Francisco. And I'm not sure if that particular Santa Fe was intentionally named after St. Francis, but the one in I believe the one in New Mexico is. St. Francis, the saint of pacifism. Clearly not happening here. So when I saw this happening, I tweeted out, how much do you want to bet that Republicans will offer thoughts and prayers, but to avoid ridicule will use slightly different words? After all, they need that NRA money to hold power to continue to rip off the middle class. And Smarty Bob tweets back at me. He says, Thom Hartmann hits the nail on the head again. Donnie T. Rump avoided thoughts and prayers, but said sadness and heartbreak. We are grieving with you. And then said many phrases that begin with, may God, may God, may God. This con man can't say God enough lately. It works. Yeah, he's trying the old Mike Pence scam, right? But here we are. We have another mass shooting, another school shooting. And apparently it was a student, possibly two. We don't know. I mean, a lot of details still to come in. And apparently the shooter set off the fire alarm in the school, which causes, I mean, the training that they give you, or that they're doing in our schools now, which is also traumatizing our kids. The training that they're giving in our schools is when there's an active shooter, you lock the doors, you barricade the doors, everybody stay in their room, nobody go in the hall, because you go in the hall, you get shot. And one of the recent shooters set off the fire alarm specifically to get people into the hall so he could shoot as many of them as possible, and apparently this kid did the same thing. And also apparently, and again, this is all subject to, you know, as we learn more details, but this is what's being reported right now tentatively, is that one of the people who was shot but not killed, but might be the adult who is in critical condition in surgery right now, was the school cop. They call them resource officers. The resource that they have is a gun. Police in schools have radically increased the number of children who are being sent to criminal detention centers, children's jails, children's prisons, ending up with children's criminal records, particularly young people of color. And Trump is like, yeah, we're going to double down on that. But apparently the so-called good guy with a gun did not stop the bad guy with a gun this morning, although, again, we don't know. But, you know, what we do know is that this is not a good thing. That this is, you know, one more time. So, anyhow, anything goes Friday. I'm going to pick up some phone calls here, and you know, if you want to be in the queue for Congressman Pocan, be sure to tell our call screener that when you call in. And in fact, for that matter, when I put you on the air, if you'd rather wait and you've got a question for Pocan, just tell me and I'll put you back on hold. So, but if you've got something you want to riff about this morning, go for it. David in Greenfield, California. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
My question is for Mark Pocan.
Okay,
Sorry.
let me. That's quite all right. Let me put you back on hold. Don, do you have a question for Pocan, or you want to talk about something else?
Yes, I'd like to talk about something else.
Okay, go for it. Tell me your city and state, by the way. It didn't get written down.
Okay, we're in Winsboro, South Carolina.
Great, thank you.
Okay, my wife and I are both military retired. We constantly hear we support our troops.
Right.
We have an issue of something I'd like the country to know. There's a few armed forces retirement homes in this country. One of them I'm familiar with, and I'm thinking about going to. I'm 71. Is in Gulfport, Mississippi. Now, the people in the home, for their payment to be there, they have to pay 40% of their gross income, not net income, but their gross.
Is this a Medicaid requirement?
I think the armed forces is in part of the government.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. So, but the point is.
So this is a military benefit, because I remember when my mom, needed. We ended up not putting her in a home because one of my brothers took her in. but this was after my dad died, and she was sliding away into dementia. And we had to completely bankrupt my parents' estate before she could do that, or we would have had to had we decided to do that, and that was because of the Medicaid requirement. But apparently this is something else. Excuse me, Don, for interrupting you.
It's something else. It has nothing to do with Medicare. But my problem is that I and my wife are thinking of going to this home, but the last time I called them a couple of weeks ago, they said the gross 40% income going for the payment is going to be increased 1 October to 60% of your gross income. There had been a jump from 35 to 40, and that went for a couple of years.
Right.
But now they're going to increase it 50%. Now, this home is already full. There's waiting lists. And the people that are there have given up their homes, their whatever lifestyle they had, to go to an assisted living home because they're getting older. But then they drop a bombshell on them of going from 40% gross income to 60%.
Yeah, and my prediction would be, as the Republicans continue to look for money to pay for their tax giveaway to the billionaires, the so-called GOP tax scam, that's going to get even worse.
A problem I've heard why they're asking for this income, because the home is losing $20 million a year. Since Trump's been in office, he has spent $80 million in golf excursions, cost, et cetera, for these golf excursions in less than 2 years.
Yep.
But they're concerned about the government having a funding problem for a retirement home, armed forces retirement home, of $20 million a year. It seems like they could turn over a rock or two and find some additional funding for this home.
Well, see, Don, you're assuming that the party that controls the House and Senate right now cares about veterans, and they don't. They only care about veterans when there's a photo opportunity.
Well, I understand that, but again, I'm just calling to sort of put out the word a little bit of anyone that might hear. And I've been a follower of yours for years and years, and appreciate your program.
Yeah.
And I just sort of want to get it out on the air. And the people at the home right now, I'm talking to them. They're trying to get petitions, et cetera. They're trying to call their congressman, et cetera, et cetera. And
Don,
I
if you
need
can,
your assistance. One thing, if you'd put the numbers for the House and the Senate again up on your screen.
Sure. Well, I can tell you what it is. The same numbers will get you to either one, but the number is 202-225-3121 or 224-3121. And but what would be useful? I mean, give me a call next week, and if you can find where did this happen? Was this part of the budget bill? Was this part of the military appropriations bill? Was this, just unique to this particular facility? If this is something that's systemic, if this is something that Congress has something to do with, we need to know the details in order to be able to call members of Congress and say what's going on. So if you can get a little more detail for me, Don, I'd be glad to give you a platform to publicize it, okay?
Okay, I sure will, Tom. I lived in Portland a few years. I love your program. I love Portland.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great town. In fact, Stormy Daniels is here tonight. Don, thanks a lot for the call. Louise and I were actually, she's going to be at a strip club here tonight. Maybe we should go. I don't know. Anyhow, Timothy in Milwaukee, are you on hold for Pocan, or do you want to?
No, this is a broad question or idea for.
Okay, Timothy, could you please take me off the speakerphone?
Sure.
Thank you.
You're on my headset. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. This is for anybody listening 50 statewide who might, or for the states that don't have marijuana laws, progressive marijuana laws. I'd like people across the country to initiate ballot initiatives to legalize or at least decriminalize marijuana. And I think if that gets on the ballot this November, it's going to get a lot of young kids out. And I don't know what it takes to. I hope there's enough time still to get those initiatives on ballots, but I'd like to plant the seed now, so that if it takes a couple months and people can do it, I think that's just one way to look forward.
It's very wise advice, Timothy. The conservatives have been playing this game for decades. They would put ballot initiatives on that ban abortion or this, that, or the other thing, and it just, you know, the whole point of it was to crank the conservative base and get them out there. Yeah. And it worked, you know, they worked quite successfully, even though they knew that they were unconstitutional laws, that they would never pass. If they were passed, they'd be struck down. But decriminalizing pot is not unconstitutional. It can be put on ballots. In fact, it's passed in some states that way. And it will bring out young people. You're absolutely right. Timothy, thanks for the call. And thanks for listening to us there in Milwaukee. We'll be back. Congressman Pocan will be with us right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with Congressman Mark Pocan. Your calls for Congressman Pocan at 202, what's our number? 808-9925, right after this. And welcome back. Congressman Pocan, you with us?
I am.
Hey, wonderful, wonderful. We'll reintroduce yourself when we rejoin our commercial stations in 4 minutes. But right now we're live on Free Speech TV and on all our non-commercial stations and on YouTube and Facebook and everything else all across the country and the world. So what's going on in Congress right now?
And my apologies for being late. We're running the Farm Bill, and we knew that they were having difficulty lining up their members, you know, when they basically shut us out of negotiations and made very lopsided attacks on people receiving supplemental nutrition assistance, food stamps, essentially, program, that they are not going to get Democratic support. So they wouldn't work with us on the bill. They went places that they knew we couldn't go. But then the Tea Party also stood up against it because they're trying to get some concessions on a bad immigration vote on a bill and some additional cuts with the rescission bill potentially coming up. So it's been one of those battles where they just couldn't even break 200, and they need, you know, about 218 to get something through Congress. So Paul Ryan voted the other way. They did a reconsideration. They're leaving that open so they can try to revisit it. But because they couldn't line up their votes, just the process turned out to be longer than usual.
Well, that's a good thing, isn't it? I mean, my understanding is that the Farm Bill had two major poison pills in it. One was cutting food stamps, SNAP benefits, and the other was dialing back on funding for programs that help farmers remediate, you know, basically wastewater and things like that. You know, make
conservation.
Conservation.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, and those were two, but there's also some other things too. But they just didn't even work with us. So this wasn't even a normal farm bill where, again, it's kind of a unique marriage between some more urban interests, although there's certainly poor people in all areas around the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and then the more traditional ag program. So this marriage has always made the bill be a bill that could pass. And then, of course, you know, Paul Ryan showed once again that, you know, he is to leadership as I am to, you know, modeling great hair care. I'm bald, right? It just doesn't. But Paul is not exactly doing a bang-up job here, and today was just one more example of him not doing that bang-up job.
Yeah, apparently. The wow. So you know, what else is going on in Congress that we need to know about right now?
Yeah, you know, I think there's going to be a lot of things going on next week, especially because we'll have the National Defense Authorization, the NDAA bill up.
All right, this is the military authorization.
Yeah, I think there's over 400 plus amendments. I know I alone, I think, have 4 or 5 or something like that we've submitted, from everything from Israel and Gaza to Yemen to, you know, everything else that people are introducing amendments. So that'll be a big thrust of the week. And then because I'm in appropriations, we've been in markups for the last several weeks, and that's taking 5-hour chunks of my day up right now. So It's just a busy time.
We had a caller a few minutes ago who was about to retire. He's retired military, and there's a retired military retirement home, I guess, you know, or whatever you call them, in his state. As I recall, it was Alabama or Mississippi, but I could be wrong. And he said that it used to be you had to pay 25 or 30% of your income to get in there, whether your income is Social Security or whatever it may be. He said that this year they're jacking it up to 40%, and they're concerned next year it's going to go to 50%. Is that something that came out of the military bill?
I couldn't even tell you, because that's not something that I've even had a chance to see yet, because it's coming up next week. It may be, Tom, I just don't know.
Okay. All right. We're gonna rejoin our stations, and We'll be right back. Congressman Mark Pocan with us. Stick around. Well, Congressman Mark Pocan is back from voting on the Farm Bill, which did not pass. He represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Pocan.house.gov is his website. You can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. Congressman, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
So glad to have you with us. So shall we pick up some phone calls?
Absolutely.
Okay, David in Greenfield, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thank you for taking my call. Did the SAFE Act get passed? If no, can we go back to exit polls to check for redshift and do hand recounts for suspicious exit polls? I don't believe that 100,000 people in the Detroit voter district cast no vote for president in the 2016 election, and if we had done a hand recount, we would know it.
And we also would have Hillary Clinton as president. Congressman?
Yeah, David, so first of all, no, the SAFE Act has not even had a hearing yet. With this majority, they're not looking to fix elections, unfortunately. Well, actually, they are looking to fix them, but a whole different kind of fix than we're trying to do with the SAFE Act. SAFE Act, as you know, trying to make sure that we've got the ability to have paper ballots with all machines. We're having random recounts of elections in 5% of all elections to discourage anyone from tampering, to put the definition of elections under the nation's critical infrastructure definition, so it's treated like banks and the energy grid, to provide the maximum security, and other measures that would make sure our elections are more secure. So, no, we haven't even had a hearing yet. What's interesting is, now there are more moves, and you're going to see more coming out next week from the Democrats around good government and elections and other things as we're moving forward with getting closer to November. But that's part of the problem is, like, right now, I don't think you can go back. You don't have paper ballots, and many times they're not stored after a certain amount of time. There's very little ability to go back and check that. That's why one of the key provisions of the SAFE Act is to say immediately you're going to have recounts in 5% of all elections. While it may not address specifically exit polls, because that may be a little difficult because who took the exit poll, et cetera, still it accomplishes the same thing you're saying. Let's provide that extra way to make sure with a paper ballot someone hasn't played with an election.
Tom in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. You're on the air with Congressman Mark Pocan.
Hi, gentlemen. I've just got a quick idea about how we can uphold the Second Amendment and at the same time have effective gun control. The idea is that we allow citizens to own as many arms as we want, but only the types of arms that were available at the time when that document was written.
There you go.
I hear you, Tom. I do think you bring up a really key point, right? That let's think about what type of weapon was used, how long it took to load it, and the speed at which mass damage could happen versus now. And, that's why we have a Constitution. It's a living, breathing document, and we have to have at least consideration. That wasn't even what they thought of at the time with the Second Amendment, and certainly we've all agreed as society there are reasonable controls that we can put on there that still protect a Second Amendment right, and that's where I think the vast majority of the public are on a number of issues. But we, again, can't get this Congress to act because the gun manufacturers, a.k.a. the NRA, put lots of money and lots of effort into elections. So the good news is, Tom, people are standing up to the NRA, even in places like northern Wisconsin where everyone hunts. They're making the distinction between no one is really trying to go after their rifle for hunting, and that's not what the NRA is. The NRA is about gun manufacturers who want to sell more guns so that they have bigger garages than their neighbors. And the more we talk about that greed versus the survival, I think we're going to win on the gun violence issue.
Yeah, we've got a couple of calls on mass shootings. I don't know if you caught the news this morning, but about a half hour ago or so, or an hour ago, it broke that in Santa Fe, Texas, a little small town in Texas, in a school, it looks like a high school or middle school, between 8 and 10 kids are dead. People are dead. Apparently, the school resource officer was shot as well. The shooter is in custody. He was unharmed. There may be he may have a collaborator, but it's the 22nd school shooting so far this year.
It's just ridiculous. And now next week we'll have a moment of silence, and then we'll have absolutely no moment of action, which is why, again, I think people are starting to look at November as the moment of action. Yeah,
I tweeted this morning that my prediction is that the Republicans, instead of saying thoughts and prayers, will say the same thing, but in other words, because those words are being ridiculed now. And sure enough, Donald Trump came out and said, "We're here for you. God is with you." And it's like, He would not use the word thoughts, and he would not use the word prayers, but he said the exact same thing. It was
Well, sometimes I don't know if
pathetic.
he has a lot of thoughts, so.
Yeah, well, there is that too, yeah. And the idea of Trump praying is a little frightening, actually. Congressman Mark Pocan, it's Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Congressman Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, taking your calls live here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back. His website, pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Congressman Pocan's Twitter handle, REP, Mark, M-A-R-K-P-O-C-A-N. Congressman Rep. Mark Pocan is his Twitter handle. We'll be right back. Today we're reading from Requiem for the American Dream, The 10 Principles of Concentration of Wealth and Power by Noam Chomsky. Brand new book. From the preface, a note on the American dream. During the Great Depression, which I'm old enough to remember, it was bad, much worse objectively than today. But there was a sense that we'll get out of this somehow, an expectation that things are going to get better. Maybe we don't have jobs today, but they'll be coming back tomorrow and we can work together for a brighter future. This was a time of a lot of political radicalism that would hopefully lead to a different future, one with more justice, equality, and freedom. Breaking down repressive class structures, and so on. There was just a general sense that this will work out somehow. Most of my family, for instance, were unemployed working class. The rise of the union movement itself was a reflection of, and a source of, optimism and hopefulness. And that's missing today. Today, there's a general feeling that nothing's coming back. It's over. The American dream, like most dreams, has large elements of myth to it. Part of the 19th century dream was the Horatio Alger story. We're dirt poor, but we're going to work hard and we'll find a way out of it, which was true to an extent. Take my father, who came in 1913 from a very poor village in Eastern Europe. He was able to get a job in a sweatshop in Baltimore and gradually work himself up to the point where he could go to college, get a degree, and finally even a PhD. He ended up living what's called a middle-class lifestyle. A lot of people could do that. It was possible for immigrants from Europe in the early days to achieve a level of wealth, privilege, freedom, and independence that wouldn't have been imaginable in their countries of origin. But now we simply know that that's not true anymore. Social mobility, in fact, is lower here than it is in Europe. But the dream persists, fostered by propaganda. You hear it in every political speech. Vote for me, you'll get the dream back. They all reiterate it in similar words. You even hear it from people who are destroying the dream, whether they know it or not. But the dream has to be sustained. Otherwise, how are you going to get people in the richest, most powerful country in world history with extraordinary advantages to face the reality that they see around them? Inequality is really unprecedented. If you look at total inequality now, it's like the worst periods of American history. But if you refine it more closely, the inequality comes from the extreme wealth in a tiny sector of the population, a fraction of the 1%. There were periods like the Gilded Age in the 1890s and the Roaring '20s and so on, when a situation developed rather similar to this. But the current period is extreme. Because if you look at the wealth distribution, the inequality comes mostly from super wealthy. Literally, the top 0.1% are just super wealthy. This is the result of over 30 years of a shift in social and economic policy. If you check, you find that over the course of these years, the government policy has been modified completely against the will of the population to provide enormous benefits to the very rich. And for most of the population, the majority, real incomes have almost stagnated for over 30 years. The middle class, in that sense, that unique American sense, is under severe attack. A significant part of the American dream is class mobility. You're born poor, you work hard, you get rich. The idea that it's possible for everyone to get a decent job, buy a home, get a car before their children go to school, and have their children go to school, it's all collapsed. Take a look at American society. Imagine yourself looking down from Mars. What do you see? In the United States, there are professed values like democracy. In a democracy, public opinion is going to have some influence on policy, and then the government carries out actions determined by the population. That's what democracy means. It's important to understand that privileged and powerful sectors have never liked democracy, and for very good reasons. Democracy puts power into the hands of the general population and takes it away from the privileged and powerful. It's a principle of concentration of wealth and power. Concentration of wealth yields concentration of power, particularly so at the cost of, as the cost of elections skyrockets, which forces the political parties even more deeply into the pockets of major corporations. This political power quickly translates into legislation that then increases the concentration of wealth. So fiscal policy, like tax policy, deregulation, rules of corporate governance, and a whole variety of measures, political measures designed to increase the concentration of wealth and power, yields more political power to do the same thing. And that's what we've been seeing. So we have this kind of vicious cycle in progress. I mean, the wealthy always did have an inordinate amount of control over policy. Actually, that goes back centuries. It's so traditional that it was described by Adam Smith in 1776. You read the famous Wealth of Nations. He says in England, quote, "The principal architects of policy are the people who own the society." In his day, in Adam Smith's day, merchants and manufacturers. And they make sure that their own interests are very well cared for, however grievous the impact on the people of England or others. Now, it's not merchants and manufacturers, it's financial institutions and multinational corporations. The people who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, and they're following the vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. They're just going to pursue policies that benefit them and harm everyone else. Well, that's a pretty general maxim of politics that's been studied closely in the United States. Those are the policies that have increasingly been followed. And in the absence of a general popular reaction, that's pretty much what you'd expect. Then we get into principle number 1, reduce democracy. And, he goes through his 10 principles. The book, Requiem for the American Dream.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. It's Middays with Mark. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls live on the Thom Hartmann Program. And Dan in Santa Clara, California, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, how you doing, Tom? Congressman. I will take exception to when the congressman responded to the last caller where they compared the Second Amendment in its original written by the framers, and that they had that people then had muskets, and that the Constitution needs to grow and breathe as times change. You're missing the point. The reason why the Second Amendment was there is to keep a tyrannical government from oppressing the people. And so the people then had weaponry that were similar to or equal to the potential tyrannical government or military force. So if the Constitution is a living, breathing, growing document, wouldn't then the people then have an ability to be similar to what the framers had intended?
Yeah, Dan, I think what I was actually trying to get at, and I do think you're right, it's a better way of putting it is we've, as a society, have decided that there are reasonable restrictions on still having that right, Second Amendment right. I don't know the conversation you just had. I'm not quite sure if I followed it completely, but I can say that the idea that we should be talking to people about is no one's trying to, I shouldn't say no one, but I don't think the mainstream thought is to change the Second Amendment. We want to make sure that people who hunt can continue to have a hunting rifle, and people who may have a handgun for personal protection continue to do that. But we're saying when you have weapons of mass destruction, when you have automatic weapons, when you have from the magazines the size you have the magazines, when you have loopholes in the law that you can, off of an internet website, which no one ever, foresaw, you could buy a gun from someone in a parking lot with a bag full of cash without any kind of check that we have when you go to a store. Those are the kind of things that we should really be looking at. And as, a society, figuring out how to still preserve that right that is provided by the Second Amendment. So perhaps I wasn't as clear, and it's probably a better way to say it, and hopefully I said it a little better now. What we're trying to get across is that there are reasonable restrictions that still fall within constitutional rights, although certainly the time period the Constitution was written is very, very different than it is today when it comes to weapons.
Yeah, I would like to respond, too, to him, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I just finished writing a book on the Second Amendment that's going out to the publisher next week. And for this book, we searched through literally the entire record of James Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention, the ratifying conventions of all 13 states where they ratified the Constitution, the debates in those states, and the debates in Congress around the Bill of Rights. Nowhere in any of them is there even one single reference to any founder or framer of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights suggesting that its purpose was so that average Americans could shoot at their government, so that they could overthrow a tyrannical government. It does not exist. This is a lie. It first appeared in 1972 in the NRA magazine, and it was, in fact, it was an article written by a high school student suggesting this as a possibility, and it has taken on this mythic status, particularly among the Tim McVeighs of the world, who actually believe we have a tyrannical government and it needs to be blown up. Tim McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, he believed this. And this belief is one of the most toxic beliefs we have, and people use it to justify things like trying to murder Steve Scalise.
Wow. That's great, Tom. I'm looking forward to that book because, there hasn't been a lot like you're talking about right now written about this issue. And yet, again, here we are today. I didn't even know about it because it was on the floor voting while it happened, another school shooting. And, we need to get smarter on this issue. The good news is, I really do think this is great news, Tom, is that people are connecting the dots, that the NRA is not about protecting hunters or people who want a handgun for personal protection, that the NRA is about gun manufacturers trying to get rich. And in Wisconsin, when we had that Supreme Court election in April, NRA was an issue because they backed the conservative candidate running. And normally in the northern part of the state, where everyone hunts, it's a huge family tradition. People have voted very much on what you'd call the NRA side. They voted in one of the congressional districts 49% for our candidate, the other one 50.5%. They're connecting the dots that the NRA is not them. The NRA is actually just what we're saying about gun manufacturers trying to get rich. So there's tremendous progress in the last 6 months or so, and Parkland students and students across the country deserve tremendous credit for that. And I'm looking forward to your book.
Yeah, the NRA is just another K Street lobbyist. Mark in Washington, D.C. Mark, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good afternoon, Congressman Pocan and Tom. Tom, first of all, quickly love your show. First heard about your Joe Madison show 2 years ago.
Oh, thank you. And Joe's a great guy.
Oh, he is. He is. I've been a follower ever since. Congressman, I was just calling. My concern is, of course, with the mass shooting that just happened in Santa Fe, Texas. Is there any way we can find out who are the congressional or senatorial staff that's supporting the NRA, so we could put this measure out there to other people on social media and other areas so these people know, hey, these are the guys that are supporting the NRA, and this is what we need to do to try to get him or her not reelected into that seat, because this is too much. Our schools are now becoming war zones instead of being places of education.
Yeah, 22 school shootings this year so far. Congressman?
Great point, Mark. I mean, that's one of the things that we saw in that race is the NRA was actually a detriment. Their endorsement was a detriment to the candidate. And I think that's what we have to keep doing. If we keep making sure that people know who the NRA is endorsing, in some districts and primaries, people are going to tout it, but we'll see who starts to hide the endorsement or not want the endorsement. When we can make it to the point that the NRA is a liability if they support you, we are at a point where we can get common sense gun laws passed in every state and nationwide, and that's what we need to do. So you're right. Let's call out the NRA for exactly what it is, and then call out the people who get their support, and that's an important second step.
Let me, by the way, add, in the when we were searching through the debates at the writing of the Constitution, Madison's notes on the Constitution, we were actually able to find a reference to people wanting to have a conversation about undoing a tyrannical government in the United States, but it was not about guns. It was about the impeachment clause. That's why the impeachment clause is there, to prevent if a tyrant were to become president. Carolyn in Lynn Haven, Florida. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, Congressman. As an atheist, I would like to thank you for your support in Congress for the Free Thought Caucus. I'm a member of Freedom from Religion, and I read on their website that you and 5 others support atheist issues, and I thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. What we are trying to do is make government run the way it's supposed to, with a separation of religion and state. And I think there's so many issues, from having a prayer on the floor every day we start. I, on behalf of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is based in my district in Madison, Wisconsin, a great organization, very, very proud of what the work they're doing. We actually put a request in to have someone come and do that opening invocation, and it was turned down by Father Conroy. And they changed the reasons a couple times, and that's just one example. But there's so many areas where we've had people in the military who are treated differently if they're non-theist, and so many others. And we just want to make sure there's no discrimination against anyone, period, right? I think people can have different religions, but you can also not be religious. And we have to make sure that we're following what this country is about, which is a separation of church and state. So what we did is we founded this caucus, Tom. I think there may be a few more than 5 now that are members, but we're just trying to make sure that we can talk about science in a scientific way. We can talk about religion in a way that doesn't pick winners and losers, and respects people who aren't religious.
That's absolutely brilliant. Tim in Mesick, Michigan, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello, Congressman.
Hi there, Ken.
I was calling about immigration, but all this, nonsense about the Second Amendment. Then why didn't, the Founding Fathers say, you can buy cannons and all that stuff? But anyway, that aside, all I can say is Bernie, Maxine, 2020, the perfect vision for America's future right there. And getting back to immigration, I've worked all over the country at different newspapers, and when I decided to stay in Boston, and the topic of, illegal Mexicans. Okay, one guy was Italian.
Tim, excuse me, what's your question for Congressman Pocan? We're just about
I just want to make a point about immigration and this nonsense that, all these illegal Mexicans. Why is it illegal? Go to Boston. Go to the North End. See how many illegal Italians are there. Go to the South. Go to Southie. See how many illegal Irishmen are there. Go into the Erie pub and find out.
In other words, this is not just a problem with Hispanics. Congressman, we're going to hit a break in just a second. Your
I think, Tim, you're right. I mean, obviously people, this is based on racism, much of what is out there on the immigration debate, and that's what we face in Congress and we face sometimes in the public, and we need to get smarter and better about it. And I think, should things change in November, we've got an opportunity. Last thing, really quick, Maxine and Bernie, you said that was your dream ticket. I just want to say they were 2 of the original founders of the Congressional Progressive Caucus over 25 years ago. So proud they're still around, and proud that they helped found the work we're doing right now with 78 members strong.
That's amazing. And you are the co-chair of it. That's great. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Middays with Mark, with the Congressman Mark Pocan. Rep Mark Pocan is his Twitter handle, his website, pocan.house.gov. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Leslie in Central Square, New York. You are on the air with Congressman Pocan. Thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV.
Hello, Congressman.
Hi, Leslie.
Glad to meet you. My name is Leslie Dean, and I'd like to make one quick statement, and then I got to talk about something else. One quick statement is, in the health care bill, if one progressive Democrat had put a hold in, it would have never been a tax bill gone through. Okay? The other thing is, I've seen 2 big ads in the last 2 weeks by the Republican Party, and one of them alone, I sat there and listened to 5 or 6 lies, one right after the other. You never see the Democrats come back and go against it, rebuff anything. They leave everything to stand like it's true. Every time. They never rebuff anything, okay? And they don't rebuff anything Fox News says. They don't rebuff anything Rush Limbaugh says. They don't rebuff nothing because they leave everything to stand. And as far as I can see, they haven't done anything this year to fight it back against the Republicans. Nothing that I can see anywhere, okay? In the news or nothing. Nothing's going on, You got to come back with specific things that open the eyes of the voter on both sides, and that would be that we'll let them know about that health care bill and stuff like that.
Okay, Leslie, let's get Congressman Pocan's thoughts on what you had to say.
Yeah, Leslie, first of all, on the health care bill, I mean, because of the process, how they did the health care changes, if this is what you're talking about, the changes they did were within the tax bill, and that was one that they could do it with 50 votes, so you couldn't have a hold stop it. It wasn't one that was affected by a 60-vote rule, so just want to make sure that's clear, because there are certain ways they can go around, not often, but they can go around the 60-vote rule in the Senate, and in that case, there's nothing you could do on the health care bill with the 60 votes. Second, I do have to say, Leslie, we've had this conversation a lot in the show, and I disagree that Democrats just say nothing back. The problem is the corporate media doesn't really cover us. We have an enormously hard time to get on unless we want to talk about Russia. Even networks that are friendlier to us don't put Democrats on to talk about Democratic issues. And we say things here. We have press conferences all the time, groups like the Progressive Caucus and others, with our outside partners. But if they're not covered by the corporate media, which they're never covered by the corporate media, you don't necessarily know that they're happening. So it's not so much a problem that Democrats aren't saying something. It's a problem that we have a hell of a time getting coverage for the things that we do. And, I think part of that is just another conversation we have to have about the corporate media.
Yeah. Congressman, we have 45 seconds to the break. You mentioned last week that, values instead of issues. Could you give me a couple of value statements that can put some flesh on those bones?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example is, that something that you'd find wide consensus around is that, people believe that everyone should have opportunity for their family to advance, right? I mean, something like opportunities, and that is something that we've seen general widespread support. And I think that's like a good example. When you talk about that, then we're talking about things that make sure we're inclusive for all people. We're talking about the ideas of how to do that economically, so it's not just things going to the top 1% and 2%. But if you can find those common statements, that there's some continuity among no matter who you're at, you can show that our ideas are better than theirs, because with their ideas do not provide opportunity for everyone. So that's just like one example, but I think it's one of the key examples is that, we have an overall platform that makes sure that families and people in general have opportunity, and if they have opportunity, they can then be able to succeed where their policies don't take us down that road.
That's great. Thank you so much. We'll be right back. And taking your calls, Sam in Holly Springs, North Carolina. Sam, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good afternoon, Congressman. Good afternoon, Tom. First-time caller.
You
I am so sick and tired of all the bullshit that's going on.
All right, Sam, we cannot use language like that on the air. And Sean, you dumped that. Thank you very much. My apologies if any of that slipped through. George in Atlanta, Georgia, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Hartmann, for taking my call. Congressman, I have two questions. One is there a way that we, the people, can get on the ballot for the people to vote on outlaw and automatic weapons? Because it's our schools and our place of worship that are being victimized with assault weapons. And my second question is, if there is a anti-lynching law passed, would you support it? Because there have been 200 attempts to pass an anti-lynching law. The first one was in 1918 by Representative Dyer. It's called the Dyer anti-lynching law. And if there's an anti-lynching law come up again, would you support it?
Sure. George, thank you for your questions. On the first one, it depends on state to state and sometimes community to community whether you have binding referendums or not. In my state of Wisconsin, they're only advisory. In states like California, I know they have binding referendums. So I think you're going to have to look at your local community, but I certainly think these are the types of things that you can try to impact, whether it be around common sense ways to address gun violence, or for that matter, tax policy, how you deal with big corporations, other things. We're seeing success in the local communities right now, where clearly in Washington we're not. And those are going to be the pathways for us moving forward, especially if things go well in November. So you'll have to look at your local jurisdiction, but I think it's a great suggestion to use those types of initiatives to advance ideas, especially in the local level. Second, I'll be real honest, I didn't even know there wasn't anti-lynching legislation. I would assume that there would have been. So you've informed me today. I appreciate that, and I think I would be supportive of something. Of course, always the devil's in the details of a bill, but I don't know why I wouldn't be supportive.
Horace in High Point, North Carolina. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good afternoon. Sir, I want to know if you could write a letter to the special counsel concerning the conduct of Devin Nunes, because in my estimation, he has obstructed justice at least 3 times. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me address it this way if I can. I mean, I think Devin Nunes, the best way we can deal with him most directly is to make sure that in November he's allowed to return to the private sector or get a job in the Trump administration, or whoever would hire someone who's had such buffoonery in the last 2 years. But quite honestly, it's gone way beyond the last 2 years. But, you know, watching how he's carried out the Intelligence Committee in the House, the fact that this week the Senate comparable committee in a bipartisan way admitted that the Russians interfered with elections, and yet we can't even get that out of Devin Nunes because he's such a sycophant for the president, and he's done everything from, you know, getting information at the White House one night and bringing it there the next day, and all the drama that he's done. He has been a disservice to Congress. I think he's been an embarrassment on all of us, Democrat and Republican alike, and I hope that his voters, and from some polling I've seen, they are getting it, that they would rather have someone who maybe they don't agree with on every issue than someone who's embarrassing them on nearly every issue. And that's the best way to deal with Devin Nunes.
Irving in Evanston, Illinois. You're on the air with Congressman Mark Pocan.
Hello.
Hello, Irving. You're on the air.
Well, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm very disappointed with the Democrats regarding voter, particularly the fact that they don't do anything about cross-check. I've been following Greg Palast ever since 2000, and the only place I ever hear him is on Tom's show or Amy Goodman, but he never gets on again. And there's no question in my mind, in his mind, and maybe even Tom's mind, that cross-check was the reason that Hillary Clinton lost the election, particularly the fact that she lost Michigan by 10,000 some odd votes, when supposedly about 2,000 votes were thrown away in Michigan in 2 cities, Detroit and Flint, Michigan.
Okay, Irving.
And I never hear the Democratic Party leaders talking about
Irving, we have 50 seconds left. Let's let Congressman Pocan answer.
Yeah, Irving, so I was going to say, first of all, I think Democrats are stopping Greg Palast, who I think is a great journalist, from getting coverage. I can't take credit for that. I can tell you, because of listening to this program, we actually drafted a bill, and there is a bill introduced in Congress to deal with cross-check. So you can't say Democrats aren't doing anything, because we actually have a bill introduced and people are sponsoring. We're trying to put the idea forward. I can't say anything for DNC or someone else. Part of the problem goes back to the earlier discussion. Unless the corporate media reports it, you won't know we're doing it. But I can tell you there is a bill formally introduced in Congress to directly deal with the problems of cross-check.
Wow, that's great. Let's see. Yeah, we just have 15 seconds. Week ahead?
Week ahead, look for, I think, action around NDAA, especially next week, plus rescission. They're trying to cut the deal. We had a deal on an omnibus bill, and now they're trying to take some of that money back. If they do things like that, they're going to have a hard time getting anything through this body. So watch for those two issues in particular.
Great. And we look forward to talking with you again next week.
Yep, absolutely. Hopefully on time, Tom.
Okay. No, it's all good. Thank you so much,
care.
Congressman. Great talking with you. Congressman Mark Pocan. Pocan.house.gov is his website. You can tweet him and tell him hi. Tell him thank you for being on our program at Rep. R-E-P Mark M-A-R-K Pocan P-O-C-A-N. Rep. Mark Pocan. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeets.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Notes on Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787, reported by James Madison. That would be the Constitutional Convention where everybody got together and wrote the Constitution. This is from Wednesday, August 22nd. Article 7, Section 4, resumed. Mr. Sherman was, and this is Madison's notes, so he's reporting what Mr. Sherman said. Mr. Sherman was for leaving the clause as it stands. He disapproved of the slave trade. Yet as the states were now possessed of the right to import slaves, as the public good did not require it to be taken from them, and as it was expedient to have as few objections as possible to the proposed scheme of government. The proposal, by the way, was to ban the importation of slaves after 1808 with the assumption that the states would rapidly end slavery shortly thereafter. And you'll hear that in just a minute. It was expedient to have as few objections as possible to the proposed scheme of government. He thought it best to leave the matter as we find it. He observed that the abolition of slavery seemed to be going on in the U.S. and that the good sense of the several states would probably by degrees complete it soon. He urged on the convention the necessity of dispatching its business. Colonel Mason spoke. This infernal traffic originated in the avarice of British nations. The British government constantly checked the attempts of Virginia to put a stop to it. The present question concerns not the importing of slaves alone, but the whole Union. The evil of having slaves was experienced during the late war. Had slaves been treated as they might have been by the enemy, they would have proved dangerous instruments in their hands. What he's talking about is the British offering slaves freedom if they came and fought for the British. But their folly dealt by the slaves as it did by the Tories. He mentioned the dangerous insurrections of the slaves in Greece and Sicily and the instructions given to Cromwell by Cromwell to the commissioners sent to Virginia to arm the servants and slaves in case other means of obtaining its submission should fail. Maryland and Virginia had had already prohibited the importation of slaves expressly. North Carolina had done the same in substance. All this would be in vain if South Carolina and Georgia were at liberty to import. The Western people are already calling out for slaves for their new lands and will fill that country with slaves if they can be got through South Carolina and Georgia. Slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the immigration of whites. They produce the most pernicious effect on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. He lamented that some of our Eastern brethren had, from a lust of gain, embarked in this nefarious traffic. As to the states being in possession of the right to import, this was the case with many other rights now to be properly given up. He held it essential in every point of view that when the general government should have the power to the general government should have the power to prevent the increase of slavery. Mr. Ellsworth rose to spoke. As he had never owned a slave, could not judge on the effects of slavery on character. He said, however, that if it was to be considered in a moral light, we ought to go farther and free those already in our country. As slaves also multiply so fast in Virginia and Maryland that it is cheaper to raise than import them, whilst in the sickly rice swamps foreign supplies are necessary, if we go no further than is urged, we shall be unjust toward South Carolina and Georgia. Let us not intermeddle. As population increases, poor laborers will be so plenty as to render slaves useless. Slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. Provision is already made in Connecticut for abolishing it, and the abolition has already taken place in Massachusetts. As to the danger of insurrections from foreign influence, that will become a motive to kind treatment of the slaves and former slaves. Mr. Pinckney, if slavery be wrong, it is justified by the example of all the world. He cited the case of Greece, Rome, and other ancient states, the sanction given by France, England, Holland, and other modern states. In all ages, one half of mankind had been slaves. If the southern states were let alone, they would probably of themselves stop importations. He would himself, as a citizen of South Carolina, vote for it. An attempt to take away the right as proposed will produce serious objections to the Constitution, which he wished to see adopted. General Pinckney rose to speak and declared it to be his firm opinion that if himself and all his colleagues were to sign the Constitution and use their personal influence, it would be of no avail towards obtaining the assent of their constituents. South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. As to Virginia, she will gain by stopping the importation. Her slaves will rise in value, and she has more than she wants. It would be unequal to require South Carolina and Georgia to confederate on such unequal terms. He said the royal assent before the Revolution had never been refused to South Carolina, as to Virginia. He contended that the importation of slaves would be for the interest of the whole Union. The more slaves, the more produce to employ the carrying trade, the more consumption also, and the more of this, the more of revenue for the common treasury. He admitted it to be reasonable that slaves should be dutied like other imports, but should consider a rejection of the clause as an exclusion of South Carolina from the Union. Mr. Baldwin rose to speak, said he had conceived national objects alone to be before the convention, not such as like the present were of a local nature. Georgia was decided on this point. That state was always hitherto supposed a general government, and on it goes. It's a fascinating insight into what these guys were thinking and debating.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Oh, this is absolutely bizarre. At the school where the shooting happened in Santa Fe, Texas, a man carrying a pistol on his hip, wearing a Make America Great Again hat, and carrying an American flag has shown up at the school. What the hell? This is crazy. Anyhow, it's Anything Goes Friday, whatever you'd like to talk about. Bernie in Cleveland, Ohio. Hey, Bernie, it says here you want to disagree with me. What's up?
Hey, I wanted to talk about the Second Amendment.
Okay.
And so one of the problems I see in the anti-Second Amendment arguments and your reference to Madison earlier, if you're against the Second Amendment, you should say, hey, we don't believe in private gun ownership. When you try to act as if the Founding Fathers did not intend for the citizens to be able to arm themselves, you're ignoring history, you're ignoring constitutional jurisprudence. The term arms, it says the right to bear arms. Arms is short for armaments. It's not just about guns. Armaments included cannons, mortars. They had all that technology at the time. The founders wanted the everyday citizen, the average citizen, to have access to weaponry. Should the government ever become tyrannical?
Not true.
Should
it's simply not true. If that was, listen, Bernie, if that was true, it would be recited. You know, if Thomas Jefferson had said that, or James Madison had said that, or Patrick Henry had said that, or any of the other founders had ever said anything even remotely close to what you're saying, it would be burned into the brains of every gun owner in America, and it would be in 72-point type across the top of the NRA's building. It does not exist. Yes, you're right. The idea was that everybody that all men between the ages of 17 and 47 in the original states, those were the typical ages. There was some variation from state to state. Were required to be members of state militias, at least in the southern states. And those state militias were also in the states of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, referred to as slave patrols. And all white citizens had to show up at least one day a month. In Georgia, it was one day a week in North Carolina to participate in the slave patrols and go out in the back roads and look for any slaves who might be running away or even thinking about it and scare the crap out of them. Absolutely, you're right. And the two constituencies that wanted the Second Amendment were, number one, the northern folks who were saying that we are worried about, which included the Virginians, Jefferson and Madison, who were concerned that standing armies were typically the instruments of tyranny, not governments, standing armies. They were the ones that overthrew governments regularly, and by the way, they still do. It just happened in Egypt a couple of years ago, right? So they did not want us to have a standing army during time of peace, which is why when Jefferson became president, there were 300,000 men under arms, and he dialed it down to 6,000 people in 1808 when he in the last year of his term. So correct. They were all about making sure that there was no standing army during time of peace. But that was not to stop the government. That was to stop the army.
Well, what is the army? It is an arm of the government. But here's the point. The Founding Fathers wrote the Second Amendment. It's quite explicit in its language. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. William Rawle.
You're omitting the first part of it.
Well, no, I'm not. How am I? Militia being
a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. And by the way, in the original draft, it in addition to having a half sentence at the very end of it, which said that no person who conscientiously objects to military service shall be forced to serve. So it ends with the militia, and it starts with the militia. This was all about individual states having militias, and it said the first draft was a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free nation. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and those, and I forget the exact language, but those who are opposed to military service shall not be forced to serve. This was all about state militias, and Patrick Henry got up. And you can read this. Just Google this. If you plug my name in, you'll find it very easily. But you can find it without my name at all. Patrick Henry, Virginia Ratifying Convention, 1789. The Second Amendment. Patrick Henry got up and said, and again, you can read this easily. In fact, I've got it printed out around here someplace, but I'm not going to take the time to find it. Patrick Henry got up and said that if we ever got a president and Congress was ever controlled by Northerners, that they would use that Second Amendment, the militia being necessary for a free nation. They would use that Second Amendment, and they would use Article 1, Section 8, which gives Congress and the President the power to call up the military, and there's parts of Article 2 that also give, he's commander-in-chief of the military, that they would give the president and Congress the power to call up the military and free the slaves. Henry's exact quote was, "Will they not search that document, this Constitution, for looking for a way to enact manumission, which is, freedom of the slaves. They did this during the Revolutionary War, and we will see it again should this pass." And again, I encourage you to read Patrick Henry's actual speech at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. James Madison then got up and said, "Sir, you are being paranoid. You are, this is not the intention of anybody." And Patrick Henry said, there are over 600,000 slaves in this state. There were more slaves in Virginia than there were white people. He said there are 600,000 slaves in this state, and he, by the way, was the largest slave holder in the state. And this amendment puts our peace, our liberty, and our property, in other words, slaves, at risk. And Madison said then, as a compromise, let's change the word nation to the word state to protect the slave patrol of Virginia. And Patrick Henry accepted that, and that's how the Second Amendment became what it is. And I'm not making this stuff up. You can read it yourself.
No, but that again, that's wholly irrelevant. You're acting as if the Second Amendment was only put into play to protect slave owners. That's not necessarily true. The Second Amendment. It was put into place for,
as I said, two reasons. Number one, to protect the slave owners, and number two, to prevent a standing army from overthrowing our government, which, by the way, some people would argue has already happened. But that's a whole other discussion, and you're not going to solve that with guns.
Well, when you say well-regulated, you got to understand what that means colloquially. Liberals will take that well-regulated, say, look, they meant a well-regulated militia. Militia, by definition, is not necessarily a mechanism of the state. Militias can be completely organically derived. A militia does not have to be a state-sanctioned entity. And also, well-regulated colloquially meant well-trained. It literally meant people who can shoot well.
I don't know where you're getting your information, Bernie, but at the time, and again, I encourage you to read.
Well-regulated meant.
You've never read the debate. Go back and read the debate. There were 3 different debates on this topic, major debates. The first one was in August of 1787 in Philadelphia at the when they wrote the Constitution. Actually, it was in early September. The second one was a year and a half later, almost 2 years later, in the spring of 1789, when it was being debated, and in each one of the states in the ratifying conventions, although the major debate was in Virginia, and that's where it actually got modified. And the third was in 1791 when it was actually ratified by Congress. I have read all 3 of those. And I'm telling you, well-regulated meant under the control of the governor of the state.
No, that's not true. Look up the colloquial definition. A well-regulated militia meant a well-trained militia.
There's no dictionary of colloquial definitions, and that's not what Bernie. Read the history. This is nuts. Jan in Orlando. Hey, Jan, what's on your mind today?
I'm just so glad you had that conversation just now, because that's really where I was going, because it just seems to me that a major driver in the Second Amendment was to control slaves. And if you don't really understand that, and you look at behaviors now, hundreds of years later, you can really see how this is derived. I mean, if you are black and you have an automatic weapon, odds are, and you're out in the public, odds are you're probably going to get arrested. If you're white, that's probably not going to happen.
Right.
And you can see how this has all happened over the years. And so if you say to me that slavery was not a driver for the Second Amendment, I got some land to sell you somewhere, because this is ridiculous. Right. You can see it right now how this has been part of the American story to this day.
You're absolutely right, Jan, at least with regard to the southern states. In the northern states, the Second Amendment was not about slavery. It was about not having an army that could do a military coup. But in the southern states, it was all about slavery. It was all about preserving the slave patrols. And that's why Patrick Henry took on James Madison, Henry being the largest slaveholder in Virginia, who ironically said, give me liberty or give me death, and said that he wanted the word nation changed to the word state so that Virginia could protect their slave patrol. Forgive me for interrupting you.
Oh, no problem. I guess I have to change my question, because I think you really hit on every question I had with regard to your book. When is your book coming out? And I really want to talk to my students about some of the stuff that it's going to, there's so much uneasiness with regard to having these conversations, even with college students, with regard to how the Second Amendment was derived and the connection with slavery. I think that's always the point in which people get very uncomfortable about the very issues that are part of our history.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, when is your book coming out? I'd like to use it in my teaching.
The book hopefully will be out sometime this fall, at least in digital form. The printed book will probably be out early next year. And we're still debating the title right now, Jan. And I would encourage you, if you Google Thom Hartmann, in quotes, Second Amendment, in quotes, and slavery, you'll find several articles that I've written on this topic. Thanks, Jan.
Is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back. And also, Nate points out there are several YouTube videos where I go through this too, and I actually read Patrick Henry's speech. You can find those on our YouTube channel. And welcome back, Mark Taylor Canfield, our reporter friend in Washington State, in Seattle, Washington. Mark, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's up?
Hey, Tom. I wanted to give you and your listeners some background on a story that I've been covering up here between the David and Goliath battle in Seattle between City Council member Shama Sawant and the $700 billion behemoth Amazon and Jeff Bezos. And it's over affordable housing. I'm writing about this over at BuzzFlash, and I'm doing some reports at the NTC Report on YouTube. But the council just barely avoided a veto by Mayor Jenny Durkin. The original proposal was for $75 million tax on employees' hours at corporations that make more than $20 million in revenue a year. Mm-hmm. But last-minute pressure from Jeff Bezos and Amazon was able to ratchet that down to a proposal for $48 million, which the council actually voted on unanimously. But that was because of a threat by a veto from our supposedly progressive mayor, Jenny Durkin, former,
Isn't Jeff Bezos the richest man in the world?
He is.
Why does he care about something that's going to generate something equal to, the amount of money he makes in probably less than 3 seconds?
Exactly, and that was Shama Sawant's original statement on that. Actually, the Seattle Chamber of Commerce did their own commissioned report and found that we need at least $400 million to house the homeless in this area. And just so people know what's going on here, during the last homeless count in Martin Luther King Jr. County, where Seattle's located, 11,600 people are without permanent residence, and 4,000 people are sleeping outdoors every night in the city of Seattle, which my statement on this is, Tom, if these these economic refugee camps were located on an international border, they would qualify for assistance from the United Nations and the Red Cross. But because they're in the middle of our city, and by the way, we have the third largest homeless population in the country, only behind New York and Los Angeles, our state legislature has prohibited any kind of rent control in the state, and that was due to some zealous Republicans. And, my question is, of course, where's the rest of this money going to come from if Amazon's able to come in at the last minute over just, the last week or the last weekend and change the vote? And is it, how can you really say, if you're not willing to pay your fair share, if you've dislocated an entire population of people and the rent has tripled and the real estate prices have gone through the roof and people are leaving the city who have lived here for 35 years, how can you say that you're a good community partner if you're one of those major corporations? And it wasn't just Amazon who was opposed to this tax, but if you're one of those large corporations making billions of dollars in Seattle and you're not willing to pay your fair share, can we really then consider you a good community partner?
Well, and it also...
And where is corporate social responsibility, Tom?
Yeah, and well, beyond that, I'm not sure that corporate social responsibility... Let me rephrase that. I'm not sure that corporations should be involved in governance. I mean, it's certainly, the First Amendment gives them the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, in other words, to lobby. But because of the Buckley decision in '76, all the way, and a whole series of other Supreme Court decisions all the way up to McCutcheon in 2013, we now have corporations calling the tunes. We've got corporations deciding what's happening in cities and state governments, and federal governments too, for that matter. We got corporations having the entire Republican Party denying climate change, for example. Mark, it's obscene. It's absolutely obscene. Thanks for the call and thanks for the update. I appreciate it. It's always nice to hear from you. We'll be back It's 21 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. It's Anything Goes Friday. Gordon in Wheaton, Illinois. Hey, Gordon, what's on your mind today?
Hi, a couple of things. We've really gone down the rabbit hole here with the Second Amendment thing. I need to, as much as I am vehemently opposed to your caller Bernie's viewpoint on the Second Amendment, I do have to agree with him on a couple of factual points and disagree with you about one of them. The Second Amendment does not ever mention guns. It mentions arms.
Correct.
And that does include cannon, artillery. It includes rockets. It includes biological weaponry. You'll recall that the British colonists actually used anthrax-infested blankets to kill off the natives.
In Ohio, yes.
Yeah. So biological weapons were available at the time, and so it would include those, even if you only use a strict historical definition of arms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, secondly, I have to disagree with you on this point. Well-regulated, I agree with Bernie on that one. It does, I think, mean actually well-trained. The regular militia, the regulated militia, it means well-trained.
I'm not disputing that it might not, the training might not encompass that, but there was a debate about to what extent the militias should be responsible specifically to the governor, to the state legislatures, or there should be federal oversight. That debate happened at the Constitutional Convention. You can read it in Madison's notes. So that issue was discussed, and nobody in that debate was talking about, well, does that mean that people know how to march? No.
Well, I think that's what the phrase "well-regulated" means. Now, I think your point is actually covered in the second part, which is being necessary to the security of a free state,
right,
as opposed to nation. That's where it's put in the control of the governor instead of the federal government.
Right.
Okay. Now.
And that was Patrick Henry's doing to preserve the slave patrols in Virginia.
So, what in fact that creates is not. The other thing is that the word "people," the rights of the people to keep and bear arms, people is a collective term. It's not an individual. It doesn't say the right of persons to keep and bear arms. It says the right of people.
You're right. And to that point, if I may quote Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Warren Burger, who I believe was elevated to that position either by Eisenhower or Nixon. And I quote, "The gun lobby's interpretation of the Second Amendment is one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American people by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. The real purpose of the Second Amendment was to ensure that state armies, the militia, would be maintained for the defense of the state. The very language of the Second Amendment refutes any argument that it was intended to guarantee every citizen an unfettered right to any kind of weapon he or she desires." End of quote. Chief Justice Warren Burger.
Absolutely. What, in fact, the Second Amendment creates is a state militia, which, because there was no standing army, or little or no standing federal army at the time, because they thought that the short road to tyranny is the state militia, what we now call the National Guard.
That's correct.
The Second Amendment guarantees each state the right to organize and arm a National Guard.
You're right.
Under the control of a governor.
You're right.
It does not grant any individual any specific right. It grants the state the right.
I agree with you, and the Supreme Court, up until whatever the year was Heller was decided, also agreed with you. and then, and I'm sorry I forget the year of the Heller decision, but when that decision happened, this weird logic that the NRA had been arguing was adopted by the Supreme Court, and for the first time in over 200 years, we understood that there was an individual right to own weapons in the Second Amendment. It's a fraud, as Warren Burger said.
Right. And just to point out a different fraud on the part of the NRA, you know, the NRA has been saying we should arm teachers. We should arm teachers with all the school shootings. Teachers aren't the targets of the school shootings.
Right. Well, but see, the reason the NRA is saying that is because they get to sell twice as many guns. You know, right now they're selling the guns to the shooters, but if they can arm the teachers, they get to sell twice as many guns. So, hey, why not? If they're a gun lobby, a K Street lobby that is in the business of increasing the profits of gun manufacturers, of course, arm all the teachers. Gordon, thanks for the call.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Anything goes Friday, and yes, we have other topics beyond the Second Amendment, although it seems to be a hot topic today, given that we are having the 22nd school shooting in the 20th week of the year. Thom Hartmann University Book Club today. We're reading from It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America by David K. Johnston. This is from page 61, the chapter titled Forgetting the Forgotten Man. In 2010, the U.S. Department of Labor created a website to honor workers who died on the job. Quote, more than 4,500 workers, lose their lives on the job every year. Below are the names of just a few who have died in recent months. OSHA's mission is to prevent workplace injuries, illnesses, and death, end quote. That Occupational Safety and Health Administration webpage was intended to highlight and humanize workplace deaths, to ensure awareness of tragedies, especially those that could have been avoided, according to Jordan Barab, an Assistant Secretary of Labor during the Obama administration. Barab explained, without information like this, fatality statistics are just raw, sterile numbers. The purpose of adding names and circumstances was to impress people with the tragedy that workers and their families face day after day. In August 2017, Trump's Labor Department quietly removed the preamble and the names when it killed the web page. It also took down, without public announcement, the fatality inspection data for all years prior to 2017. Those are just two of many other Trump administration actions inimical to worker safety. Others included no longer posting press releases about deaths resulting from unsafe working conditions, delaying rules to reduce sickness and death from inhaling silica and beryllium at work, delaying rules to lower the risk of railroad engineers and truck drivers falling asleep at the switch or wheel because of untreated sleep apnea, and the appointment to the Supreme Court of a judge who held that a company had the right to fire a worker who chose not to freeze to death on the job. A reasonable person listening to Donald Trump's inaugural address would never have expected these and other actions, assuming he believed what Trump said. Trump declared, "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no more. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens," end quote. Those men and women were forgotten again the following week. And it's not just workers whose interests were forgotten, not to mention who were put in danger. By deciding not to implement a rule to reduce the chances of truck drivers and train operators falling asleep at the wheel, Trump put at risk the lives of families driving along the highway, people riding on passenger trains, and many others. The White House called it President Trump's war on regulation. In his weekly radio address in early May, he declared that we've removed one job-killing regulation after another, and they're not pretty, and they're going. And believe me, we're just getting started on regulations. They're gone. Removal of data on workplace deaths, which averaged 13 per day, infuriated Jordan Barab, who is Obama's number 2 at OSHA. As a private citizen, Barab created a web page to keep track of the names of the dead and the reasons they were killed on the job. He called it, "OSHA won't tell you who died in the workplace, we will." After the election, Barab's concerns that the Trump administration would be bad for workers increased when he asked where the Trump beachhead team was and learned that none was coming. Each incoming administrator sends people to scope out federal agencies, learn who does what, and get a feel for the place in advance. Then the incoming administration sends its landing team, the people who will initially implement its policies for each agenda or at each agency. When no beachhead team came up, Barab figured it meant worker safety simply was not a priority for Trump. He hoped that was the worst of it, nothing more than apathy about worker safety. But when the landing team arrived, Barab realized trouble was coming for American workers. And it was not official apathy, but the start of assaults on workers' rights and safety. Barab said most of them had no idea they were going to labor and no interest in workers' issues either. What they did have was a mandate to delay, repeal, or weaken regulations that protected workers as part of Trump's plan to eliminate, quote, any regulation that is outdated, unnecessary, bad for workers, or contrary to the national interest, end quote. The first sign came when Trump nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Gorsuch was an acolyte of Antonin Scalia, whose seat he would be taking. Like Scalia, he said statutes should be literally read, and if that made no sense, well, that was a problem for Congress. Also like Scalia, he had a habit of consulting dictionaries, often following Scalia's practice of relying on the third, fourth, or even lesser definition of a word when it supported his jurisprudence. Trump's nomination alarmed unions. Jody Calamine, a communications worker of America lawyer, told Gorsuch's Senate confirmation hearing that Gorsuch, quote, is a threat to working people's health and safety, end quote. Calamine cited Gorsuch's dissent in the 2016 case to make this his point. That dissent, he said, reveals an anti-worker bias and features the judicial activism that will ultimately put workers' lives at risk, end quote. Those are unusually strong words about a Supreme Court nominee, but a review of the case shows Gorsuch has little regard for human life, at least when it comes to employers' power over their workers. He considers a rigid interpretation of the law more important. The case was about a law Congress passed giving workers the right to refuse dangerous tasks. Gorsuch said, no, you may not refuse. It's even worse than you think, by David K. Johnston.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. Anything Goes Friday. David in Woodland Hills, California. Hey, David, what's up?
Oh, well, thank you, Guru. It's been a horrible week. I had my wallet stolen and, don't even ask.
Geez, and Mercury isn't even retrograde.
No, you're right. It's not so. I will go on. Last week, I told you I would briefly explain astrology for skeptics. And
okay.
I have about a minute.
And I have a question for you when you're done.
Okay, great. Astrology is the study of patterns in nature. It's not psychic. There's no hocus pocus. It's just patterns in nature. Tom's Taurus sun sign is a pattern in nature, just like winter. It occurs at the same time every year, and there are certain likelihoods associated with the patterns. If a Martian asked you, what is winter? You'd probably say cold, snow, rain, you know. So how can it be 20 degrees and snowing in New York while 80 degrees and sunny in L.A.?
Mm-hmm.
Because nature provides wide variations among her assumptions. She's never quite the same. No weatherman can predict the temperature next August 15th at noon in L.A. It can't be done. But he can say probably between 90, 115 degrees, moderate severe humidity, especially by the beach, or you never know, could be raining and only 60 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Patterns function that way. Astrology works the same way. It's your cosmic likelihoods and their positives and negative, bads and goods. But there's also nurture, the way you were raised and what you became. What astrology predicts best is compatibility and personality, not the future. No astrologer can say you'll be hit by a bus 12:53 next Wednesday. Can't be done. Finally, last week I gave you a glowing astrological review, and you asked if it was because of the astrology or because I listened to you. It's both. I know you, I know Trump, I know you're positive, I know he's negative. I've counseled people I don't know 1,000 times, and I never charge. And the response is overwhelmingly positive, even among the disbelievers, and all I'm doing is reciting the patterns.
Right. Makes perfect sense, David. So what does astrology tell you is going to happen in the midterm election and in the 2020 election?
I don't do the future. Astrology, that's the hardest thing astrology does. I do compatibility and personality. But I must say, there are people who do the future well. I'm not one of them. Nostradamus was one of them.
Right.
He was one of those doctors, astronomers, astrologers.
No, I got all that. Any thoughts on any of the personalities who might be running for president that you have done their charts or are familiar with them?
You know, I will call back and do that, but I do love Elizabeth Warren. But let me give you an example of the patterns with you, real briefly once again. Your Chinese rabbit year is born under the sign of virtue. That means at your positive best, you don't like to lie, cheat, or steal. But at your negative worst, you will lie, cheat, and steal. So you've lied in your life, Tom. You've stolen a cookie. Maybe you shoplifted as a kid, but you're positive. You didn't like it. But I can see a possible negative in your extraordinarily positive chart, if you'd like to hear.
Sure.
Your Mercury is in Aries, the sign of the conquering leader. You were born to conquer through communication because Mercury rules communication. So a possible negative I can see is you are so good at conquering through communication, sometimes it may be hard to listen. It's almost like Rembrandt watching.
You are quoting my wife.
Tom, it's kind of like Rembrandt watching somebody else painting and going, let me finish that for you.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. David, thank you. Thanks for a break in the gun debate too. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for listening to Sirius XM. I look forward to future conversations, David. Bill in Santa Maria, California. Hey, Bill. Thanks for watching. What's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. I love to hear you talk about history and all that. But let's say they passed a law back in the early days saying it was great to have rifles to protect your family and, the kind of thing the NRA would approve of. Today we got a huge problem. Things change, and we would need a new law that would say, we can't have these super weapons that have been invented for the wars that the United States has constantly in, one after the other. In Vietnam, they invented a lot of really terrible killer rifles and used them over there. And those things have migrated into society. Yeah. Despite what the founders wrote, I would say now, to hell with that. We got to get rid of these things. This is a big danger.
Well, I think with regard to semi-automatic weapons, I agree. And this is a position that I would have disagreed with even a year ago because, I enjoy shooting semi-automatic weapons, when my brother and I are competitively shooting. He's got a .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol that is just a hoot to shoot. But semi-automatic weapons were developed as weapons of war, and you don't need a semi-automatic weapon to protect yourself. You can do it with a revolver or a rifle. You don't need a semi-automatic rifle to hunt. In fact, typically somebody hunting with a semi-automatic weapon is, or at least a high-capacity semi-automatic weapon is viewed with the jaundiced eye skeptically. And I agree with you, Bill. And I think that we need to update our laws. Basically, I'm just talking about bringing back the assault weapons ban, which was in place from 1995 to 2005. It worked for 10 years. The police departments will tell you there was actually a decrease in the kinds of crimes that are associated with these kind of weapons. Yeah. It actually worked.
But my wife's Korean. And, I'm simple-minded. I just say, hey, how many deaths in Korea from people mass shooting or killing each other? Almost zero.
Yep.
Because guns are forbidden, and the Koreans don't want them.
Yep.
So I'm a simpleton. I just say, wait a minute. Their rule is working much better than our rule.
Yes.
So we need to change, period.
Yep, well said. Very well said, Bill. Thank you very much for the call. Michael in Silver Springs, Nevada. Hey, Michael, what's up?
I was calling today to suggest that what we really need, instead of getting so caught up in the Second Rights Amendment and the NRA propaganda, is here in Nevada we passed a registration law, and really what we were trying to do is change the culture for the children for the future. But I want to suggest that we ban certain kinds of ammunition and put a tax on bullets that would make it unlikely that someone would just get emotional and use them, some really expensive tax. And I would like to change the language from the Second Amendment and guns, which is the NRA propaganda, to what in the Second Amendment gives people the right to use gun violence against me as a human being, and the violence that the guns do to human beings here. And I think if we have that kind of language, we would be much more successful at what we're trying to do. I know locally in our local government, that argument completely works. You know, the laws for the children, I'm 60, we're all set in our ways, so all the 60-year-olds can have all the guns in the world they want. I just don't want them to have ammunition, and I want to make it at the price of a house to be emotional and murder someone. I want to make it crazy expensive. So that gives me time to teach my 4 sons. I have this tremendous responsibility of 4 sons. To the best way to if you're in a confrontation, is no matter how you work it out, is you both go home. Mm-hmm. You walk away alive. Yep. And I think with some good counseling and some national advertisement like don't litter, when me and you were kids, don't litter, something as simple as that, a really expensive bullet, an immediate ammunition ban to save lives immediately, like the schools this morning. These weapons, you're right, the weapons, but let's work on the ammunition first, because the other set's so dug in. I'm willing to let them have the guns. I'm not willing to let them have the ammunition.
Well,
I was wondering what you thought about that.
There's ammunition and there's ammunition. I mean, the ammunition that's being used more often these days are what used to be referred to as cop killer bullets, and cops still refer to them as cop killer bullets. And, you know, bullets that basically, you know, fracture or explode or shatter once they get inside the body. And these things go ripping through the air at 2, 3, 4 times the speed of sound. And when they hit a human being, they literally liquefy the tissue. You get this massive increase in hydrostatic pressure throughout the entire body, the fluid, you know, dynamics, the pressure, which throws people into shock or even knocks them unconscious. This kind of ammunition was specifically designed to kill. And, you know, it's got nothing to do with trying to, you know, scare off a burglar or stop a burglar for that matter, or you know, anything else. I mean, it's just to inflict as much damage as possible. The Parkland is a great example. I think it was the first time after the Parkland shooting was the first time that we actually had the very tiniest little sliver of a conversation about how badly damaged those children were who were hit with those bullets, where, you know, you have this little tiny entry wound and then an area the size of a grapefruit that's just been turned to mush, including bone and bone fragments and nerves and muscle and everything else, you know, behind that, you know, injuries that you just literally will never recover from. So, yeah, I don't think that taxing is the way to do it. I think regulation is the way to do it. We've demonstrated that by saying you can't have sawed-off shotguns, you can't have automatic weapons, we've prevented those from being in circulation. We could do the same thing with cop killer bullets. Michael, thanks for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're going to check in with Talk Radio News in a few minutes, or Talk Media News, excuse me, and it's Anything Goes Friday. More of your calls as we continue through the program. And welcome back. Dan, watching Free Speech TV in Huntsville, Alabama. Hey, Dan, thanks for waiting on hold. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, thanks. Well, I wanted to thank Congressman Pocan for supporting that non-theist group in the state. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I was blown away by that. That's I'm not surprised that only 5 members of Congress have done it, because that is like the last taboo. You know, you got Ron Reagan out there talking about it, and that's about it.
Yeah, that's really good. And another thing he talks about, and I believe him, and I agree that the media doesn't put Democrats on much. They just don't.
Yep.
So I have an idea. It isn't my idea, but it's something. John Oliver did this deal where he made some commercials and put them on Fox, directing them at Trump. And what if Democrats made commercials, and funny ones are good because people pay attention to that more than real serious stuff, make some of them funny at least, and put commercials on it.
Fox refuses to carry commercials.
Buy some commercial time.
Fox has refused to carry the move to impeach commercials. There have been a number of commercials over the last year or so, essentially anti-Trump commercials or anti-Republican commercials. Fox simply says we're not going to carry those commercials.
Well, forget Fox. No, but Fox viewers you're not going to win them over either. How about CNN and the other
the
main media?
They'll carry them.
Show Democrats a lot.
Yeah.
You could have it pretty regular and have these positions. A lot of stuff you talk about.
Problem there, Dan, is you need millions of dollars to make it happen.
Well, they have money. I live in Alabama. I've lived here 25 years. There are more commercials this year for some reason than I can remember. They're all conservative. You know, we have Doug Jones now, and he's going to have a hard time in 2020. I mean, he won against a pedophile by 1.5%, and we really need all the help we can get. And I don't see a single Democratic anything whatsoever where I live. And it's kind of weird that they're having so much. I think if you just inundated with the same message over and over, it does work.
Yep.
And I don't hear the Democratic message hardly at all. So
well,
I know it's expensive.
The Koch brothers have put $400 million into this election cycle, and they're doing it, to take out specific candidates. One of the largest of the Democratic donors, George Soros, has only put up $7 million, and almost all of that is going to good governance groups and open society groups and things like that. As opposed to supporting candidates. So, the Republicans have this huge, not to mention money from the NRA and money from the Chamber of Commerce and money from FreedomWorks and, on and on it goes. When billionaires invest in Republican politicians, they invest a couple $1 million, they get back $1 billion in tax cuts. When wealthy Democrats invest in Democratic politicians, not only do they not get money back in the form of tax cuts, but they see their taxes go up. So, we have to really, really honor and congratulate and value the Democratic donors, the donors who are supporting Democrats and progressive causes, because they're working against their own economic self-interest. They're working for a better society as opposed to selfish, self-motivated goals, which is what you see among the donor class on the Republican side. So, that simple reality in the face of the Supreme Court saying that there are basically no limits on campaign contributions, once you include super PACs and things like that, has caused it to be, wildly asymmetrical in terms of the political warfare that's going on in this country. Dan, thanks for the call. Good to hear from you. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, Talk Media for the sane among us. And let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Loving What You Do, a new book by Ellen Ratner. On the line with us is the chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News, Luke Vargas, based out of the UN in New York City. You can follow him on Twitter at The Courier. Luke, what's up in the world today?
Busy day on the Israel front, at least here within the United Nations system. There was a major vote just several hours ago over in Europe at the UN Human Rights Council. They have voted to basically condemn the violence perpetrated by the Israeli Defense Forces on Monday along the Gaza border. And going further than that, have called for a team of investigators to figure out exactly what happened, to probe the killing of these 60 or 62 Gazans. Notably, Nikki Haley has come out with a statement in the past few minutes, and I'll just quote it for you because it's only two sentences here. At a time when Venezuela lurches toward dictatorship. Iran imprisons thousands of political opponents, and ethnic cleansing has taken place in Burma. The UN's so-called Human Rights Council has decided to launch an investigation into a democratic country's legitimate defense of its own border against terrorist attacks. It's another shameful day for human rights. A few things that jump out to me here is this is part of a strategy Nikki Haley has increasingly leaned into this week, in which it doesn't even appear that she's going to do too much direct defense of Israeli actions and is just basically pointing out other bad things that are happening. If you remember her statement at the Security Council meeting that was called on Tuesday, the day after the violence at the Gaza border, she led off for about a minute by just talking about the fact that Iran is doing all sorts of bad things around the Middle East, seeming to suggest that so long as someone else is doing something bad, that's what we should be focused on. And again, the fact that she leads off her statement talking about 3 other countries here, and then mentions that democratic countries shouldn't be questioned, even though you see countries like Germany, the United Kingdom, Switzerland abstaining from the vote today, essentially not siding with the United States, and a number of other established democracies voting in direct defiance of the United States and calling for this investigation. So the U.S. strategy here does sort of be to deflect.
Yeah, Trump totally screwed the pooch when he gave away the bargaining chip of moving the embassy to Jerusalem. It's just, this is a disaster.
Let me say one more thing. So Kuwait is the only Arab nation on the UN Security Council, and they have been working on a resolution this week. And we don't know exactly when it is going to be voted on, if it will even be voted on, but this is a UN Security Council resolution that would call for an international protection force to be deployed to the Gaza-Israel border. We don't know exactly what form this would take. According to the Kuwaitis, the inside line that I got is that they're working with the Palestinian government to sort of go through the history of UN peacekeeping operations and look at if there's a model they might try to replicate here, but the notion being actually send independent military forces to this area so that the IDF isn't the party in charge of defending that border anymore.
Right, the IDF being the Israeli army.
I doubt the U.S. would go along with anything like this, but it'll be interesting to see how it comes together.
Yeah, amen. What else is up?
I've been watching this major meeting of the World Health Organization today about Ebola. There is a new Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's been ongoing since early April, and it has accelerated in recent weeks, not just the number of cases, but they've moved out of rural parts of the jungle and the past few days to a city called Mbandaka, home to 1 million people, and just up the river from Kinshasa, which I believe has something like 14 million people. So this disease has moved in from very rural areas, low-density areas, to very high-density areas.
If this thing gets into Kinshasa, all hell is going to break loose. I mean, there's dozens of daily flights out of that city.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of brings us back to where we were in the 2014 to 2016 outbreak, when there was so much concern when I think some cases were picked up at the airport in Lagos, Nigeria. Basically, that is your entry point to the rest of the world. We don't think we're there yet, or at least the World Health Organization doesn't think we're at a level where we need to be declaring this an international health emergency. They came out today and said, look, we think we can bring this under control. And there is one key difference between this outbreak and the one from several years ago that killed 11,000 people. And that's that there's a vaccine now. Merck has a vaccine for Ebola. It's not fully FDA approved, but it is supposed to be very effective. And all international health workers going to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to fight this current outbreak have the option of being vaccinated before they go. And the World Health Organization says there are already 4,000 doses of the vaccine in the country, and many more thousands could be sent there in the next few days and weeks as needed. So there are tools that weren't available several years ago. So fingers crossed.
That's good news. What else is up?
And finally, I've been watching this U.S.-China trade talks this week. They're occurring in Washington. They're very high level. It's the second round of talks. And this, building off of the whole ZTE story from earlier this week, we have seen President Trump really repeatedly shift his posture on exactly what kind of tone he's going to be taking with the Chinese in these talks. Yesterday, he was in the Oval Office sort of rambling about this, saying China is spoiled. They're so used to getting everything they want, 100% of all they want in their talks with the United States. So you've seen him then maybe say, look, I'm not going to give them the ZTE concession, not going to allow this Chinese company to be able to keep buying high-tech American products. And we've seen some goodwill measures on the Chinese side in the past day. They have dropped an anti-dumping probe on sorghum exports from the United States, which was really a leverage point for them. When they shut down basically the sorghum imports from the U.S. earlier this year, it stranded something like 24 major shipping vessels that were taking that good over to China, and U.S. growers had to basically get rid of that product on the open market at bargain basement prices.
And this was hurting red states in the Southeast, right?
Exactly. The Chinese are very confident that they can continue to use agricultural tariff threats as a very specific point of leverage against President Trump, because, as you mentioned, those are predominantly red states that would be affected here. So this is playing out on so many fronts at once.
Fascinating stuff. Luke Vargas with Talk Media News, The Courier on Twitter. Hey, Luke, thank you.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. We'll be back with more of your calls on Anything Goes Friday here on the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where smart people get their news. Stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair chair, office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242
or visit tomsbeets.com. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Elaine Pagel's book, The Gnostic Gospels. This is from chapter 3, God the Father, God the Mother. Unlike many of his contemporaries among the deities of the ancient Near East, the God of Israel shared his power with no female divinity, nor was he the divine husband or lover of any. He can scarcely be characterized in any but masculine epithets: king, lord, master, judge, and father. Indeed, the absence of feminine symbolism for God marks Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in striking contrast to the world's other religious traditions. Whether in Egypt, Babylonia, Greece, and Rome, or in Africa, India, and North America, which abound in female symbolism. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theologians today are quick to point out that God is not to be considered in sexual terms at all, yet the actual language they use daily in worship and prayer conveys a completely different message. Who, growing up Jewish or Christian tradition, has escaped the distinct impression that God is masculine? And while Catholics revere Mary as the mother of Jesus, they never identify her as divine in her own right. If she is the mother of God, she is not God the Mother, on an equal footing with God the Father. Christianity, of course, added the Trinitarian terms to the Jewish description of God, Yet of the three divine persons, two, the Father and the Son, are described in masculine terms, and the third, the Spirit, suggests the sexlessness of the Greek neuter term for spirit, pneuma. Whoever investigates the early history of Christianity, the field called patristics, that is, study of the fathers of the church, will be prepared for the passage that concludes the Gospel of Thomas. Simon Peter said to the disciples, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman will make herself male, who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." End of quote from the Gospel of Thomas. Strange as it sounds, this simply states what religious rhetoric assumes, that the men form the legitimate body of the community while women are allowed to participate only when they assimilate themselves to men. Other texts discovered at Nag Hammadi demonstrate one striking difference between these heretical sources and the orthodox ones. Gnostic sources continually use sexual symbolism to describe God. One might expect that these texts would show the influence of archaic pagan traditions of the mother goddess, but for the most part, their language is specifically Christian, unmistakably related to a Jewish heritage. Yet instead of describing a monastic and masculine God, many of these texts speak of God as a dyad who embraces both masculine and feminine elements. One group of Gnostic sources claims to have received a secret tradition from Jesus through James and through Mary Magdalene. Members of this group prayed to both the Divine Father and Mother. Quote, "From thee, Father, and through thee, Mother, the two immortal names, parents of the divine being, and thou, dweller in heaven, humanity, of the mighty name." The end of the quote from the prayer. Other texts indicate that the authors had wondered to whom a single masculine God proposed, quote, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness," in Genesis 1:26. Since the Genesis account goes on to say that humanity was created, quote, "male and female," some concluded that the God in whose image we are made must also be both masculine and feminine, both father and mother. How do these texts characterize the Divine Mother? I find no simple answer since the texts themselves are extremely diverse. Yet we may sketch out three primary characterizations. In the first place, several Gnostic groups describe the Divine Mother as part of an original couple. Valentinius, the teacher and poet, begins with the premise that God is essentially indescribable. But he suggests that the divine can be imagined as a dyad, consisting in one part of the ineffable, the depth, the primal Father, and in the other of grace, silence, the womb, and mother of all. Valentinius reasons that silence is the appropriate complement of the Father, designating the former as feminine and latter as masculine because of the grammatical gender of the Greek words. He goes on to describe how silence receives, as in a womb, the seed of the ineffable source. From this she brings forth all the emanations of a divine being, ranged in harmonious pairs of masculine and feminine energies. Followers of Valentinius prayed to her for protection as the mother and as the mystical eternal silence. For example, Marcus, the magician, invokes her as grace, in Greek, the feminine term charis. Quote, "May she who is before all things, the incomprehensible and indescribable grace, fill you within and increase in you her own knowledge." End of quote from the Gospels. In his secret celebration of the Mass, Marcus teaches that the wine symbolizes her blood. As the cup of wine is offered, he prays that grace may flow into all who drink it. A prophet and visionary, Marcus calls himself the womb and recipient of silence, as she is of the Father. The visions he received of the divine being appeared, he reports, in female form. Another Gnostic writing, called the Great Announcement, quoted by Hippolytus in his Refutation of All Heresies, explains the origin of the universe as follows. Quote, "From the power of silence appeared a great power, the mind of the universe, which manages all things, and is a male. The other, a great intelligence, is a female which produces all things." Following the gender of the Greek words for mind and intelligence, this author explains that these powers joined in union and are discovered to be in duality. The book, The Gnostic Gospels, by Elaine Pagels.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hartmann.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, this is fascinating. Walter Einikel on the Daily Kos is writing about the school shooting this morning, the 22nd school shooting this year. This is the 20th week of the year. 22nd school shooting is in Santa Fe, Texas this morning. And reports are that 9 students and 1 teacher are dead. According to Texas Monthly, 9 members of the Texas delegation, all Republicans, received an A+ rating from the NRA. These include Senators Ted Cruz and John Cornyn. Another 18 members, all Republicans, except for U.S. Representative Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Laredo, received an A grade. 7 Texas Democrats, including U.S. Representative Beto O'Rourke, who is hoping to unseat Ted Cruz this fall, received an F rating. Only 2 of the Texas Democrats received any money at all from the NRA. So the NRA is basically, with the exception of Gene Green and Cuellar, is totally supporting the Republicans in Texas. So what are the Republicans saying about the shooting in their state this morning? Randy Weber, who has an A rating from the NRA, says, my office and I are following the situation closely and offering assistance and support, praying for Santa Fe. Pete Sessions hasn't begun praying yet, but he's received over $150,000 from the NRA, has an A+ rating. Excuse me. Failed human being Ted Cruz is a top NRA lapdog. He said, Heidi and I are keeping all the students and faculty at Santa Fe High School in our prayers this morning. Cruz is flying to Texas as we speak to jump in front of a camera and to think and pray in front of the camera. He takes large amounts of money from the NRA. John Culberson, another A+ NRA fellow, gets money from the NRA. Republican John Ratcliffe, A+ guy, he says, please join me in praying for the families. Right. Judge Ted Poe says, our hearts are with the Santa Fe High School this morning. Right. Louis Gohmert, in his teeny little heart, says, my heart goes out to those in Santa Fe High School. Brian Babin has an A rating with the NRA. Our prayers are with the students, staff, and families. Republican Representative Pete Olson, with his money from the NRA, he's closely monitoring the situation. Representative Barry Loudermilk, A rating from the NRA. We are praying for those affected by the shooting in Texas. May God be with all of them. Right. Good news, Barry, writes Walter Einikel at the Daily Kos. According to your religion, God is with all of them now, except if they're not Christian, and more specifically, if they're not your kind of Christian. In fact, statistically speaking, the person who killed all these people might be the only one with God, according to your special set of beliefs. You might want to let Texas Republicans know what you think of them. Len in Northampton, Massachusetts. Hey, Len, thanks for listening to us on 96.9 FM. What's up?
Hey, how are you, Thom?
I'm well. I'm great, but I'll get better. What's on your mind?
Well, I was just thinking about the Second Amendment, and I'll start at that. And being from the Connecticut River Valley, my mind goes back to Shays' Rebellion. And when our forefathers, or the ones that fought the Revolutionary War, went off to fight, and then they came back to see all of their farms in debt and all of the banksters in Boston, forcing debt upon them, forcing them to pay the debt in default. And they didn't like that much. They're fighting for the revolution, freedom of our country, of tyranny. And now they just realize that they have another tyranny in this country. And so what did they do? They gathered arms. They marched on the courts. They prevented them from sitting. And what did Boston do? They called the militia, the state militia. And I think it was General Lincoln that marched and took over the Springfield Armory. And if it wasn't for one reverend in West Springfield that stopped one of the main collaborators from crossing the river and joining the Shayites, they would have took over the armory and would have armed, and that was during the Articles of Confederation, of course, and then after they figured they needed a little more tighter restrictions, and then the First and Second Amendments and the Constitution came about as we know it. But at this point in our country, I just don't think there is a snowball's chance in hell to get that reversed.
Well, Shays' Rebellion was put down by the government too, number one, and you know, by a government that the people who created our government were still, you know, alive and in power, and they supported putting down Shays' Rebellion. Same thing with the Whiskey Rebellion. Yeah, George Washington actually led troops to put down one of these anti-tax rebellions, and you know, so this bizarre idea that the Second Amendment is there so that average American citizens can take up arms against their government is nuts.
Right.
It's not only nuts; it's ahistorical. It's the opposite of what history actually tells us.
It is. It is, and there's no way. There's so much slippage on the regulations now and the ways around that. I mean, you can buy a receiver, you can buy a mill, you can mill your own gun, like the school shooting in Malibu. You know, like there's so many ways for wackos to get guns now and perpetrate this mass carnage across our land, and you know, it's past the point of no return, and it's just a sad day for America, because that's not what our forefathers had in mind.
I agree. I agree. Very well said, Len. Thank you very much for the call and for making that point. Dennis in New Lenox, Illinois, listening on 92.5 FM. Hey, Dennis, what's up?
Hi. I kind of piggybacking off the last caller. I think a lot of people misinterpret the Second Amendment. When we think of a well-regulated militia, we look at it in 20th century kind of language. But if you read some of the other letters that the Founding Fathers wrote, well-regulated, all that meant was someone who had the knowledge of how to use a firearm.
Well, beyond that, what it meant was that the state would provide an armory.
No. If you read beyond just the Second Amendment, a militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, and included all men capable of bearing arms. To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms.
Who says that?
And when you, Richard Henry Lee. And then as far as like the militia, comparing it to the National Guard isn't accurate if you were thinking of somebody in the 17 or 1800s. You know, he also said that the mind that aims at a select militia must be influenced by a truly anti-republic principle. So the Founding Fathers, they feared a standing army. And they also equally feared what they considered a select militia, which is what you would consider our National Guard. So the militia
was Lee a Virginian? I'm sorry, Dennis, forgive me. I don't know who Lee was. Was he a Virginian?
Yes.
So in Virginia, the state militia was a slave patrol.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So in Virginia, the state militia was the slave patrol. So was he opposed to an independent or a privatized militia?
No, what I'm saying is that the Founding Fathers, their term militia is not equivalent to what we consider.
Well, they were not monolithic in this. There was a whole variety of opinions about what these things meant, and what they meant in Massachusetts was radically different from what they meant in Virginia.
Right. So what I would say to all your listeners is, in addition to reading the Second Amendment, look at the Founding Fathers. They have other letters that they have written on their position, where they where they were coming from, as far as what the Second Amendment basically means.
Okay.
So you can, if we read the Second Amendment and read it in the language of 2018, it's a lot different than if you read it as it was written back in, the 1700s.
Yeah, and
so there's a fear of a standing army, and the arms of just the average citizen was, in their minds, a deterrent to an overreach of government.
Right, and in the northern in the northern states, typically there were armories that were maintained. In the southern states, typically the weapons were on the plantations because they were used for the slave patrols. So there were regional differences in how these things were regulated or supported.
And the common citizen was free to have arms of their own.
Right, which means a white man.
They're right at that time. But after Shays' rebellion, Washington also said that he was not in favor of taking arms away from the people. He was never for that. He always supported the average citizen.
I don't know that there were any of the founders who were in favor of taking arms away from the people outside of the laws that said that if you were a person of color, you could not own weapons. If you were a woman, you could not own weapons. If you were indentured in the North, you couldn't own weapons. In Massachusetts, for example, even if you were white, if you were an indentured servant, you could not own weapons. If you were a pauper in some states, you couldn't own a weapon. So there were regulations of weapons, and those regulations, by the way, extended out to the Wild West throughout the through the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s very aggressively. Tombstone, Arizona, most famously, you could not bring a gun into the town. If you did, you had to check it with the sheriff. So, it's...
but was that ever challenged? Was that brought up to the Supreme Court at the time?
No, of course not. Nobody would have thought to do so. You didn't have the NRA. Dennis, we're hitting a break here, but thanks for the call. It's, a lot of food for thought here. And we can talk about a lot of things beyond the Second Amendment and militias if you'd like, or we can keep talking about militias. It's Anything Goes Friday on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of your calls right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Taking back the mainstream media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. Thom Hartmann here with you. And welcome back. Michael, watching us on YouTube. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask real quick. I keep hearing all these debates over and over again about the meaning of the Second Amendment and what the forefathers had intended and all this other stuff. What are your feelings about just repealing and replacing it altogether? I mean, it's very ambiguous. We've been debating what the Second Amendment means for going on 200 and some odd years now. I mean,
actually, we've only been debating it since about the 1950s. But I get your point is well taken, and I'm all in favor of it's an anachronistic law. It's something that was appropriate to the 1700s. And is not appropriate to today. We no longer have militias in the United States. We have the National Guard, but they really don't function as militias. They function more as disaster corps, and they're not defending. The California National Guard is not defending California from Nevada.
Right.
so it's like, but in fact, I think that there are a number of parts of the Constitution that we should reevaluate, particularly. The concept of judicial review, well, that's not even in the Constitution. That was something the Supreme Court gave it, a power they gave themselves in 1803 in the Marbury decision. But, there are a number of things that I would love to see. But that said, as long as the Koch brothers are funding an attempt to rewrite the entire Constitution to turn us into an oligarchy, formally turn us into an oligarchy, I'm very wary of doing that. I mean, but as far as I'll go, and I'll go there real vigorously, is what MoveToAmend.org is proposing. And I'm going to be keynoting their conference in D.C. in a couple of weeks, by the way, MoveToAmend.org. And, what they're proposing, which is a single constitutional amendment, which simply says two things. Number one, that corporations are not persons. And number two, that money is not the same thing as speech as defined by the First Amendment. And all those are doing, those are not, changing anything in the Constitution. They're changing decisions that the Supreme Court made, in my opinion, unlawfully, unconstitutionally. But, something like that needs to be done. But
Right.
I'm not sure I'm speaking to your point, Michael.
Yeah, I think you are speaking to my point. But I just think, it's obviously it's pretty difficult to change an amendment in the Constitution. I'm guessing.
There have been over 19,000 amendments to the Constitution proposed, and we have 29 of them, I think, or 28.
Yeah. Wow.
So, yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Well,
On the
thanks a
other
lot,
hand, it's really, really difficult, right? Like the amendment to say that Congress can only raise its pay in the next congressional session. In other words, legislators cannot vote on their own pay. That was first proposed in 1791, and it was ratified about 40 years ago. So it's sat for 200 years, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the amendment, I think it's the 27th Amendment, that lowered the voting age to 18, that was proposed in March, and my recollection is it was 1971, but I'd have to pull out my Constitution and give you the exact year, but it was right around then. That was proposed in March, and it was ratified in August. So, and that was because of the Vietnam War. It was because there was this, and in fact, I would say that was because of that song, The Eve of Destruction, Barry McGuire's song, The Eve of Destruction, where he had this refrain in it that anybody who was alive in the 70s can tell you, can sing for you. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. And, and that song promoted this constitutional amendment. So it can be done. And but it takes an enormous amount of popular will. Michael, I got to run. Thanks. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. A school shooting, the 22nd school shooting in the 20th week of the year here in Santa Fe, Texas, a small town near Galveston, Texas. And apparently 9 students, 1 teacher dead, school resource officer and the school cop shot, and one of the news agencies. And Nate, do you know who the news agency was?
ABC student is Paige Curry.
Okay, ABC News interviewed a student by the name of Paige Curry, and here is what she had to say.
I managed to keep calm through it all. There was another girl who was just freaking out. They were struggling really hard to keep her calm. It was really scary.
Was there a part of you that was like, this isn't real, this would not happen in my school?
No, there wasn't.
Why so?
It's been happening everywhere. I've always kind of felt like eventually it was going to happen here too.
Wow. When I was a kid, we worried about the Soviets nuking us, but it never occurred to me it would actually happen. I don't think it ever occurred to any of us. The whole duck and cover thing, we were mildly traumatized by it, I suppose, but it was also fun. The bell went off. We could ignore the teacher for 5 minutes and jump under our desks. This is a whole different level of frightened. This is a whole different level of terror. These shooters are terrorists. And the Republicans and the National Rifle Association are supporting terrorists when they fight against legislation that would make it harder for these people to get guns. Let's just call it what it is. Tim in Arlington, Texas. Hey, Tim, what's on your mind?
Oh, how you doing today, Tom?
I'm well. Thanks for listening to SiriusXM, Tim. What's up?
Well, I'd just like to make a quick point that, first of all, one of the reasons that we don't get any progress on hardly any issue, even life and death issues in our society today, is because no one will stop their own personal agenda long enough to say, okay, I'm not going to get the answer that I want from my perspective 100%. And that's not because that I'm all right or I'm all wrong or the other guy's all right or the other guy's all wrong. That's because that's human nature.
Can you give me one example of what you're talking about, Tim?
Well, okay, I'm going to go right to the crux of the matter. We're all concerned about this issue with firearms in school shootings, and here's a threefold measure that would help with this.
Okay.
There's no perfect answer when you're dealing with human beings, okay?
Sure.
There will always be an exception, but let's get it back to where it's an exception, not a frequent, almost daily occurrence. All right? First of all, everyone talks about, okay, we're patriotic. We are so thankful for the men and women that defend our country. And
Yeah, Tim, we have 30 seconds. So if you're going to go through 3 things, you need to do it quick.
Okay, you got 1.4 million unemployed combat veterans in this country that need a job.
Yep.
Let's take those. Most of them are riflemen trained, and you take them, you put a weapon in their hand, and you authorize them to walk a post in our schools.
So you want to turn our schools into free fire zones?
In the school zones that are supposed to be no weapons anyway, let those men walk a post. They're trained to handle their weapon. They're trained to vector in on trouble. They're trained to handle these things professionally.
Yeah.
Now, your first objection that will come is people will go, that'll cost too much money.
I'm not objecting to too much money. I'm objecting to guns in schools, Tim. Tim, I'm sorry, we're out of time. But, let me just encourage people, when you get on the air, make your big point first and then backfill afterwards. Give me the rationale afterwards. I'm sorry we didn't get to Tim's other 2 points. We'll be right back. It's 27 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with more of your calls on Anything Goes Friday right after this. In the Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from American Holocaust by David Stannard, The Conquest of the New World. This is from the prologue. Just 21 years after Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populous island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus chose to call Indians, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. It took a little longer, about the span of a single human generation, but what happened on Hispaniola was the equivalent of more than 50 Hiroshimas, and Hispaniola was only the beginning. Within no more than a handful of generations following their first encounters with Europeans, the vast majority of the Western Hemisphere's native peoples had been exterminated. The pace and magnitude of their obliteration varied from place to place and from time to time, but for years, now historical demographers have been uncovering in region upon region post-Columbia depopulation rates of between 90 and 98%, with such regularity that an overall decline of 95% in Native American population has become a working rule of thumb. What this means is that, on average, for every 20 natives alive at the moment of European contact, when the lands of the Americans teemed with numerous tens of millions of people, only one stood in their place when the bloodbath was over. To put this in a contemporary context, the ratio of native survivorship in the Americas following European contact was less than half of what the human survivorship ratio would be in the United States today if every single white person and every single black person died. The destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. That is why, as one historian aptly has said, far from the heroic and romantic heraldry that customarily is used to symbolize the European settlement of the Americas, the emblem most congruent with reality would be a pyramid of skulls. Scholars estimate the size of the post-Columbian Holocaust have climbed sharply in recent decades. Too often, however, academic discussions of this ghastly event have reduced the devastated indigenous people and their cultures to statistical calculations in reconciling demographic analyses. It was easy for this to happen. From the very beginning, merely taking the account of so mammoth a cataclysm seemed an impossible task. Wrote one Spanish adventurer who arrived in the New World only 2 decades after Columbus's first landing, and who himself openly reveled in the torrent of native blood. There was neither, quote, paper nor time enough to tell all that the conquistadors did to ruin the Indians and rob them and destroy the land, end quote. As a result, the very effort to describe the disaster's overwhelming magnitude has tended to obliterate both the writer's and the reader's sense of its truly horrific human element. In an apparent effort to contradict or counteract this tendency, one writer, Tsvetsan Todorov, began his study of the events of 1492 and immediately thereafter with an epigraph from Diego de Landa's Relación de las Casas de Yucatán. Quote, "The captain, Alonso López de Avila, brother-in-law of the Adelmanto de Montejo, captured during the war in Bacalan a young Indian woman of lovely and gracious appearance. She had promised her husband, fearful lest they should kill him in the war, not to have relations with any other man but him, and so no persuasion was sufficient to prevent her from taking her own life to avoid being defiled by another man. And because of this, they had her thrown to the dogs." Toborov then dedicates his book to the memory of a Mayan woman devoured by dogs. It is important to try and hold in mind an image of that woman and her brothers and sisters and the innumerable others who suffered similar fates as one reads Todorov's book, or this one, or any other work on this subject, just as it is essential, as one reads about the Jewish Holocaust or the horrors of the African slave trade, to keep in mind the treasure of a single life in order to avoid becoming emotionally anesthetized by the sheer force of such overwhelming human evil and destruction. There is, for example, the case of a small Indian boy whose name no one knows today, and whose unmarked skeletal remains are hopelessly intermingled with those of hundreds of anonymous others in a mass grave on the American plains, but a boy who once played on the banks of a quiet creek in eastern Colorado, until the morning in 1864, when the American soldiers came. Then, as one of the cavalrymen later told it, while his compatriots were slaughtering and mutilating the bodies of all the women and all of the children they could catch, he spotted the boy trying to flee. Quote, "There was one child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead and this little child was behind following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling on the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire, but he missed the child. Another man came up and said, 'Let me try the son of a bitch, I can hit him.' He got down off his horse, kneeled down and fired at the little child, but he missed him too. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped." We must do what we can to recapture and try to understand in human terms what it was that was crushed, what it was that was butchered. It is not enough merely to acknowledge that much was lost. So close to total was the human incineration and carnage. And it continues. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Less than 1 month ago, the students at the Santa Fe High School in Santa Fe, Texas, walked out of their classrooms to protest school shootings. CNN is tweeting about this, complete with pictures of kids holding signs. Santa Fe High School says no, says hashtag never again. Today, CNN notes, they were one of the victims. Amazing. Rich in Greenwood, Indiana. Hey, Rich, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, thanks. It should be remembered that the talent of being a good businessman is to be a good middleman. That's how everything works. And the guys are playing politics that way, too. They get between us and what they've just defined as the other side, and they play us off each other. There is a news story from this past week of an arms manufacturer in Germany. Their name is Heckler & Koch.
Right.
In German, they pronounce it Koch.
Right, and it's also their guns are sold in the United States as H&K. Yeah.
Yeah, and H&K like rock and roll, and also simply HK.
Yep.
And it turns out that the directors of this company, HK Weapons, is in legal peril. And they have become in legal peril because of the way responsibility for their product is regulated in Germany. When the kids in Parkland were doing the March for Our Lives, there was an idea that came forward that I thought was interesting. It was a completely new idea, and that was that a manufacturer is responsible somehow, and they were pointing at the Armalite manufacturing as being responsible for when people get harmed in these horrible mass numbers by their product.
Yeah, there was an effort here in the United States to hold gun manufacturers responsible back about 30 years ago or thereabouts, and Congress then passed a law basically immunizing gun manufacturers. I believe it was.
I had no idea.
Yeah,
Well,
either Congress passed
the
a law or the
point-
Supreme Court ruled. I'm pretty sure Congress passed a law immunizing the gun manufacturers.
Okay. Well, the point of this particular story is that HK weapons were found to be responsible as the murder weapons of Los Normalistas. Those were the 43 student protesters who got grabbed by the mayor's police squads and then handed over to a drug cartel, murdered and disappeared. Los Normalistas, the 43, if you see a skull with the number 43 painted on its forehead, that's what that is representing.
Which country was that? Was that Mexico?
Mexico.
Yeah.
This is in the city of Iguales in the state of Guerrero.
Right.
And the mayor calls up his police chief. The police chief snaps a button, and the city police, county police, state police, military police, and federal police all simultaneously swarm the students. And then his police chief takes those arrested kids and hands them over to the drug cartel, and they're tortured and murdered and disappeared.
Right.
And it's only been the families of those disappeared that have put the pressure on the Mexican government to continue the investigation. They've got any of this done. HK wouldn't necessarily even know that their weapons had been used if not for the pressure of the family. So people power works.
At least in a country where they haven't passed a law to immunize the gun manufacturers.
Yeah, that as well.
Yeah, fascinating. Rich, I didn't know that. Thank you. You are a wealth of information, a font of information. I appreciate it. Jeff in St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, how are you doing today, Tom?
I'm well. What's up?
Hello?
Yeah, I'm fine. What's on your mind, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm calling to talk to you about minimum pay wage for the standard public, because the machines are basically going to take all of our jobs within the very near future.
Well, they've already taken a lot of them.
Well, as automation happens, I think it's going to end up taking a large percentage of them, and the common working man will become obsolete.
So your solution is what?
Minimum standard of living charged through corporate tax.
Okay, so you're talking about the universal basic income.
If the population cannot purchase anything, what's the point of there being business to begin with?
Yeah. No, I get your point, Jeff. And, up until yesterday, I was a fan of universal basic income. What's her name? Stephanie Kelton, that's right. Stephanie Kelton was on our program yesterday, and she pointed out to me that if you had the government as the employer of last resort, because, the reality is, Jeff, that, a lot of the jobs in the industrial sector are being, given over to machines. And a lot of jobs in other sectors, I mean, even service jobs, you go into the supermarket now, and instead of, 30 checkout people, you've got 3 checkout people and 30 automatic checkout machines. So, all kinds of jobs are being replaced by computers or by robots. On the other hand, there are millions of things that need to be done in this country that could all be jobs. We need to be, planting trees. We need to be building bridges. We need to be building infrastructure. We need to be, rebuilding our schools. We've got a massive need for adult daycare, basically, caring for an elderly and aging population as the boomers are aging out. There's all kinds of jobs that we need. And the problem is that there's no money right now to pay for those jobs, so we're, $2.5 trillion infrastructure deficit. That would put everybody to work if we simply committed to that. So I think that what we need to do is say that the government will be the employer of last resort and will employ every single person who wants a job, period, without exception. And what we'll find is that during times of economic prosperity, the government really won't be hiring that many people because there won't be that many people looking for work. And during times of recession, which happens every 5 to 8 years, quite predictably and regularly, during times of recession, the government will hire more people. So it's countercyclical. It balances out the cycles of capitalism. Whereas a universal basic income, where everybody gets $10,000 a year no matter what they do, whether they're employed or not, that is not countercyclical. That doesn't help us during bad times and back off a little bit during good times. So I think that as much as I like the idea in principle of universal
I agree with you, Tom, but I kind of believe it should be a combination of both.
Well, that's fine with me. That's fine with me, Jeff. Jeff, thanks for the call. Well said. Mark in Scioto, Oregon. Am I saying it right, Mark?
Yeah. Tom, you know what I'd like to ask the NRA and these Second Amendment fanatics is why aren't they protecting us from the corporations and the drug companies that are killing our kids,
Well, your question, Mark, suggests or implies that the way to take on corporations and drug companies is with a gun, and that's a very dangerous proposition.
What my point is nothing's changed. They're still using the Second Amendment to protect the slaveholders. The corporations, what they do today is nothing more than slavery.
Well, no, let's not diminish the institution of slavery. That's like, saying what's going on right now is like the Holocaust. It's not. The Holocaust was unique. Slavery was unique. And the people who were the victims of slavery were suffering under a system that I'm guessing, Mark, you and I cannot even imagine what it must have been like.
You're right.
It is wildly unfair. And it is heavily skewed toward the billionaire class and the multimillionaire class, the top 1%. And
you know something?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know something? I don't think you'd have to even have an armed militia to go pick up some of these CEOs, make a citizen's arrest, and force the government to serve justice.
Okay, Mark.
You know what I mean?
I do.
You really don't need it.
I think the answer, though, Mark, thank you for the call. In my opinion, the answer is pretty straightforward. We simply roll back the Reagan tax cuts, go back to a 74% top tax rate, the way it was, from the 1930s to the 1980s, and which was the time of the greatest prosperity in the history of the United States. Jim in Los Angeles. Hey, Jim, what's up?
My friend Tom, Professor Hartmann. Geez, what a crazy world. The first thing I wanted to throw out, I think the millennials know. I mean, I was so impressed with those kids at Parkland. But the NRA owns the Republican Party. And I still cannot get by how millennials cannot see the difference. We are a two-party country. It's so confusing when there's, the Green Party, and now Republicans are financing Green Party.
Yeah, well, they've been doing that for more than a decade.
Wow.
Yeah,
Didn't know that.
Unfortunately. I mean, not nationally, but, on a regional basis, you get individual Republicans who look like they're going to be in a tight race with a Democrat, and they'll throw a bunch of money at the Green Party, sometimes through a third party. Sometimes they just nakedly do it. But you mentioned the Parkland survivors. Let me just share some tweets. I follow all of these people. The Hill has compiled, thehill.com has compiled a list of them. Emma Gonzalez, these are all from Parkland. Emma Gonzalez just tweeted, Santa Fe, hi, you didn't deserve this. You deserve peace all your lives, not just after a tombstone saying that is put over you. You deserve more than thoughts and prayers, and after supporting us by walking out, we will be there to support you by raising up your voices. David Hogg from Parkland, or from from Marjorie Stoneman Hospital, or school, said, get ready for 2 weeks of media coverage of politicians acting like they give a blank S-word, when in reality they just want to boost their approval ratings before midterms. Cameron Caskey, one of the Parkland students, says at least 8 students have been shot and killed at Santa Fe High School. Prepare to watch the NRA boast about getting higher donations. Prepare to see students rise up and be called crisis actors and civil terrorists. Prepare for the right-wing media to attack the survivors. Cameron Caskey, one of the kids from Parkland, says, Donald Trump does not care about school shootings. Donald Trump does nothing to stop school shootings. Don't talk to me about the Stop School Violence Act, because that does nothing to stop school shootings. Donald Trump does not care about you or your kids getting shot.
And Delaney Tarr of Parkland High School says, I should be celebrating my last day of high school, but instead my heart is broken to hear the tragedy at Santa Fe. We cannot let this continue to be the norm. We cannot. So Jim, spot on. You're absolutely right. Those kids are brilliant. They're standing up. They're speaking out. They're changing America. What is the old saying from the Bible? And a child shall lead them. We're there. And a fine thing it is. It's 46 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
More of your calls right after this on Anything Goes Friday. And welcome back, JP in Marietta, Georgia. Hey, JP, thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's up?
Yes, sir. It's an honor to talk to you. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine.
Okay, great. Things have been getting so crazy recently, especially with, the dichotomy of the Second Amendment supporters and, I don't even want to say opposers of the Second Amendment, because there's not a lot of us, of course, that say, hey, let's totally get rid of the Second Amendment. But two of the craziest things I've seen in the last week or so, one of our Georgia gubernatorial candidates, I believe his last name is Kemp, put out a campaign ad where he's cleaning a shotgun next to, as he says, a boy that'd like to date his daughter, and has the kid go through, his different priorities and respect for the Second Amendment, all that stuff. And
patriarchy lives.
Yeah, it was very, very tasteless. And then also what I had, mentioned to your call screener, a girl graduated from Kent State, I believe, a couple days ago, and carried her brother's AR-10 to graduation.
Yeah, I saw that in the news.
And
that was bizarre.
Was able to go on Fox News and claim how people were being racist towards her because they were saying that she was exhibiting her white privilege.
Right, and this was in the state of Ohio, where in the last 2 years, 2 unarmed black people, including Tamir Rice, 11 years old. The other one was a young man who was in a Walmart carrying a BB gun. Tamir Rice was carrying a toy gun. They were both executed by police for being black and carrying what looked like guns. And she carries an actual gun, but she's a white blonde. And then she goes on Fox News, as you correctly pointed out, and whines about people saying that she's demonstrating her white privilege. Duh. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. JP, thanks for the call. Well said. Bill in Old Town, Florida. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
Yeah, hey, Tom. How you doing?
Good.
It's kind of on the subject a little bit.
There is no subject. It's anything goes. What's up?
Basic income.
Yeah.
And everything. I was wondering why the Democrats don't just say it like it is and call it U.S. royalties. I mean, for we the people. I mean, we're here, we contribute, and all that kind of thing.
That's a great slogan. That's a great slogan, Bill.
For like mining and oil and
all
our research on meds and
yeah.
But we never get any royalties from any of that. So instead of calling it a basic income, it makes it sound like welfare. Why don't they just say GOP would understand that? No, this is royalties.
Well, you know how they do it in Alaska. The state of Alaska has an enormous amount of oil, and unlike other states like Texas, for example, where they basically just say, the oil's yours, buddy, if it's your land, or even if it's on public lands. In Alaska, they charge the oil companies a fee for, they say this oil, if it's under the ground of Alaska, whether it's a private or public owner, that oil belongs to the citizens of Alaska, and so you're going to pay a small tax. And I'm sorry, I don't know what the amount of the tax is, but you're going to pay a small tax on every drop of oil you pull out of the ground. And the result of that is that every citizen of Alaska gets somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000 every year from what's called the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is now a multi-billion-dollar fund. And that's every man, woman, and child in Alaska. In fact, Sarah Palin, when she was running for vice president that particular year, she jacked the permanent fund payments up to the point that her own family made $40,000 that year just from the Alaska Permanent Fund. That's a good idea, Bill. Thank you. That's a great idea. We'll be back. Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program. It's 9 minutes before the hour. Tazio in Ithaca, New York. Am I saying your name right?
Yes, you are.
Great. What's on your mind?
I would like to argue that we don't have a right to a well-regulated militia because in Oakland, in the middle 1960s, they put one together.
You're talking the Black Panthers?
Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. They put one together, and, you know, they were very well-regulated. They knew all their rights and how to work everything.
Yep.
And they passed the Mulford Act very soon after.
That was passed 1 week after Bobby Seale and Huey Newton walked up into the California State House with a couple of shotguns.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you think you have a right to a well-regulated militia, I mean, you can try. It might work if you're white. But, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that surrounding the Second Amendment is very anachronistic, as well as the Constitution,
and hypocritical.
At least the first 10 amendments. Hypocritical? What do you mean?
Well,
you mean because it will happen to white?
Right.
White
The Second Amendment was written for white men. Period.
Right. And it could have. Oh, and now I just reminded of that Clive and Bundy thing. So they could form
exactly.
sort of a.
Can you imagine if
militia,
those
but
guys
it
up on
couldn't
that bridge pointing those guns at federal officers had been black?
Yeah, I don't know what would.
Can you imagine? I mean, it would have been a Holocaust. It would have been. It would have been a bloodbath. Tazio, thanks for the call. Well, brilliant point. Dave in Federal Way, Washington. Hey, Dave, what's up?
Hey, Tom. If you feel like it, and since it's Anything Goes Friday, hey, the other day a caller called in and he said that he believes, like a lot of climate scientists, or some climate scientists, that we're past the point of no return on global warming. And you respectfully disagreed with that perspective, and you said you think there are things we can do, right now to ameliorate the damage.
Well, yes and no. Let me just qualify that real quick, Dave, and then you can have all the time you want. I think we are past the point of no return for civilizational damage and possibly civilizational destruction. I don't think we're past the point of no return for the extinction of the human species. Back to you.
That's exactly kind of how I look at it, because if you just look at the human fossil records and you look at like anthropology, the Homo sapien even has survived, has had a rehabilitative population that's a lot lower, than I think any amount of damage that we could do.
Yeah, our population as fully developed humans has been apparently as low as 80,000 people.
Right. Yes, exactly. You can still, it's rehabilitated, right?
Yes.
But I think we can, if we do, implement climate saving measures now, though, like renewable energy and everything. I think the gene pool, for lack of a better word, forgive me for that, the gene pool would be even larger. Even more people would survive.
Yes, and thus more diversity, which is good for any species. Yeah, I'm with you, Dave. I completely agree. Thank you very much for the call. Betty in Sacramento. Hey, Betty, what's up?
Hey, Tom, nice to talk to you. Thanks. It's a long-range question. I'll just want to hear your thoughts, and I'll get off. At some point, we have to find a way to reintegrate the right that has been hearing a steady stream of lies from Fox News and right-wing hate radio. How are we going to do that?
That's a good question. I mean, after the Civil War, we tried to reintegrate the South, back into the Union, and with Reconstruction. And within a couple of years, Reconstruction got blown up, and the South, they started their rehabilitate the Southern Generals strategy, and really, bumped it up in 1913. Betty, I guess, a certain number of them, the average age of Fox News viewers is 70, and the vast majority of them are white. And 70-year-old white people, maybe another 10 years, they're going to be a force, but beyond that, they're going to be sitting in rest homes or they're gone. So right-wing hate radio concerns me more, frankly, because it's reaching out to young people, and you've got these. In fact, there was a really good article about this on Daily Kos today about how YouTube has become the place to go for right-wing haters, for bigots and Nazis and whatnot. And they're monetizing this. They're making money out of this. And so, it's like we've got to figure out a way to break this multi-generational cycle. And I don't have the answer. I thought, maybe the European experience, I mean, look at Germany, you've got the rise now of the hard right. The rise of the Nazis is happening in Europe right now. Viktor Orban in Hungary is almost a Nazi. He's a total authoritarian. And Merkel is dealing with this crisis in Germany of the rise of the hard right. It's like, you'd think that we would learn from history. Apparently not. But Betty, I think all we can do, thank you for the call, I think that what good people of goodwill need to be reaching out and need to be engaged. That's the number one thing, is getting engaged, participating in the political process, informing people. If Fox News is going to lie to people, you tell them the truth. If right-wing politicians are going to deny climate change and deny, racism and all this other stuff, you tell them the truth. We've got to do that. We are the people we've been waiting for. And so, democracy is not a spectator sport. It means you've got to get out there, you got to get active tag. You're it. We'll see you next week. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.